Imagine you died on a burning highway and opened your eyes to a world where a number hangs above every person's head. The higher the number, the stronger you are. The dead around him have 20s and 40s, but he has 1,000,000,000. And now, a barefoot woman whose eyes are full of stars says this is her gift and asks him not to let her down. The first thing Daniel Carter feels is ash, gray and fine as flour. It clogs his nostrils and grinds between his teeth. Dan is on his knees in the middle of a dead plain and doesn't understand a thing. The sky is the color of an old bruise. 2 suns hang over the horizon, and one isn't moving at all. The air smells of burnt iron and rotten fruit. 20 paces away lie bodies, 18 people. Some were torn apart so badly that Dan doesn't immediately realize they were people. He looks at his hands, ordinary, calluses from the pull-up bar and a knife, the hands of a survival instructor. He remembers the highway, remembers the burning car, remembers handing a child to a passerby, then a blow, then nothing. And now there's ash and 2 suns. He looks up and sees a number. It hangs right above his head, ghostly and glowing like a neon sign in the fog. 9 nines. He blinks. The number doesn't fade. He rubs his eyes. The number remains. And then he hears a voice, soft and calm, like someone who knows that time means nothing. Dan turns around. A woman is standing before him, barefoot. Her clothes are made of light. Not fabric, not armor, just light. Her eyes reflect not the 2 local suns, but dozens of stars in each pupil. She smiles as if she's known him her whole life. She says that he gave his life for a stranger's child without even asking his name. She says she hasn't seen anything like this in a long time. She asks him to accept a gift and try not to disappoint her. She calls him by name, Daniel, and she vanishes. She doesn't walk away. She doesn't fade away. She simply ceases to be, as if someone had turned off a projector. Dan sits back on his heels. He looks at the corpses, at the number, at his hands. It's quiet inside his head. No panic, no screams. Just the steady, cold voice that 12 years in the army have hammered into his subconscious. Water, shelter, orientation. As for who this lady is and why he now feels as if he owes her for the rest of his life, he'll figure that out later. The coffin, by the way, has just become very long. He stands up, dusts off his knees, and walks toward the nearest body. Not to loot, bury. The earth is hard as stone. The ashes have caked into a crust. Dan grabs a flat stone with a sharp edge and chisels away at the ground. The first grave takes 2 hours. He doesn't know the name. A man in his 40s with calluses and dark circles under his eyes. Someone's father. Dan lowers him into a shallow pit and covers him with ashes and stones. The second, a woman, young. A thin chain around her neck with a star-shaped pendant. Dan takes the pendant and hides it in his pocket. If he finds the family, he'll return it. Third, fourth, fifth. His hands are bleeding. The calluses burst on the 3rd grave. He doesn't stop. The shifting sun slides toward the horizon. The second one hangs as if glued in place. At the 10th grave, he notices a faint number above the body, 47. Barely visible, fading away. So everyone has a number. That means it's something local. And his billion is something entirely different. 11th, 12th. He counts each one, memorizes the faces. At the 18th, he freezes. The body is small. A 14-year-old teenager with sharp cheekbones. The number above the head is 22. Dan stands over him for a long time. Then he digs, more carefully and deeper than all the others. He lays the boy down straight, covers him with dirt, sits down beside him, is silent for a minute, stands up. 18 graves, 7 o'clock. Hands covered in blood, knees in ash. Now he can survive. He looks around. The plain stretches out in all directions, flat as a table. Something darkens to the north, rocks or ruins. About 3 kilometers. He'll reach it before dark. But first, water. He returns to the belongings scattered near the bodies. He finds an empty leather flask, a knife with a serrated blade, a coil of thin but strong rope, a tinderbox, and flint. 3 items that separate survival from death. He tucks everything into his belt and heads north. The ashes crunch under his feet. The air is getting colder. Dan walks steadily, army pace, 4 kilometers an hour. 40 minutes later, he sees the first tree, if it is a tree. The trunk is black as coal. The branches are bare and twisted. But it is alive. The bark feels as warm and damp. He examines the ground. Cracks in the ash. Something glistens in the cracks. Moisture. He drops to his knees and digs with his knife. 20 centimeters down, the ash is wet. 30 centimeters down, dirty water with the smell of iron seeps through. Dan doesn't drink. He fills his canteen with water. He builds a fire pit out of stones. He strikes a flint. The dry bark catches fire on the 3rd spark. You can't put a leather canteen on the fire. He needs a container. Dan walks toward the rocks. 20 minutes later, he finds a crevice. Inside are the remains of something rusty and old. Among them is a concave piece of metal, the size of 2 palms. Almost a bowl. He returns to the fire. He pours water into the metal. He sets it over the fire. The water boils in a couple of minutes. Dan lets it boil for a while. He takes it off the heat. It cools. He tastes it. It tastes like iron, but it's clean. No cramps or burning sensation. It's drinkable. He drinks half of it slowly. He boils the second batch and pours it into the flask. A supply. Now for shelter. The crevice is narrow but deep, about 3 meters long and 1.5 meters wide. A stone overhang juts out from above. Dan gathers dry ash and spreads it out as a bedding. He drags the fire toward the entrance. The fire warms the walls and the reflected heat flows inside. He sits down, leans his back against the rock, looks up at the sky. The moving sun has set. The still one shines dimly like a nightlight. The stars are foreign, not a single familiar constellation. Dan closes his eyes, opens them. A number glows softly in the darkness. 9 nines. He exhales. The first day is over. 18 people have been buried. Water has been found. There is shelter. The fire is burning. Tomorrow, he'll scout the area, find food, figure out what kind of creatures live here. Understand the rules of this world. Understand what the number means. Understand who that woman was. So many questions. But that's for tomorrow. Right now, he's alive. That's enough. Daniel Carter closes his eyes and falls asleep in a crevice at the edge of the dead land, with a 1 billion-digit number above his head and a knife in his hand. He woke up to a sound, a low scraping, as if someone was dragging metal across stone. Dan opened his eyes and didn't move. The fire had almost died out. The embers glowed red. The motionless sun hung in the sky in the same spot. The scraping sound repeated, closer. Dan slowly turned his head. Something was moving at the entrance to the crevice. Dark, the size of a large dog, 6 legs, a shell made of something resembling baked ash, a head flat and elongated like a lizard's, 2 dull yellow eyes. The creature stood 3 meters away, swiveling its head from side to side, sniffing. Dan gripped his knife. The creature took a step forward, another step. Dan didn't move. He looked at it and assessed. Size, weight, speed. The shell covers its back and sides. Its belly is exposed. Its legs are thin. Its joints are vulnerable. The creature hissed. The sound was like steam from a kettle. It lunged, fast, faster than Dan expected. He rolled to the side and slashed upward with his knife. The blade slid across the shell and didn't pierce it. The creature spun around and slammed into his side. The blow felt like a baseball bat. Dan flew toward the wall of the crevice and hit his back against the rock. Pain shot through his spine. He saw a number flash above his head. 99999999991. 8 points. A creature the size of a dog had taken 8 points with a single blow. Interesting. The creature lunged again. Dan was ready. He stepped toward it and stepped on its front left leg. The joint cracked. The screamed and collapsed on its side. Its belly was exposed. Dan stabbed it. Once, twice, 3 times. The blade sank into the soft tissue between the plates of its armor. Dark fluid gushed onto the ashes. The creature twitched and went still. Dan stepped back. He wiped the knife on his pant leg. He looked at the number. 999999991. The damage was real. The pain was real. His back hurt so much it was hard to breathe, but he was still standing. Anyone else with a constitution of 40 or 50 would be lying on the ground with broken ribs after a hit like that. But he just felt pain. That's what the buffer is. Not strength, not agility, not healing. He just doesn't die from what others die from. He looked at the carcass. Meat. Maybe edible, maybe poisonous. Only one way to find out. Dan slid open the creature's belly. The insides were dark red, almost like earth reptiles. Liver, intestines, something resembling a heart. The smell was sharp, but not rotten. He cut off a small piece of muscle tissue from the hind leg, rubbed it on the inside of his wrist, waited 15 minutes. No burning, no rash. Held it to his lip. He waited 10 minutes. Nothing. He put it on his tongue. It tasted like raw chicken with a hint of copper. He spat it out. Now he had to wait 8 hours. The universal edibility protocol. Skin contact, lip, tongue, spit out, wait. If there's no nausea or cramps after 8 hours, then it's safe to proceed. While he waited, he set to work. He surveyed the area around the crevice. To the north, the cliffs rose higher and gave way to a rocky ridge. To the east, the plains stretched on. To the west, he noticed a dark strip, maybe vegetation, maybe another ridge. He chose the west. After 20 minutes of walking, he found a ravine. Not very deep, about 2 meters. Shrubs grew at the bottom. The leaves were small and gray-green, rough to the touch. Dan plucked a leaf and rubbed it between his fingers. The smell was bitter and astringent, familiar, very similar to willow bark, salicylates, natural aspirin. He memorized the spot. If anyone got sick here, these leaves could bring down a fever. In the ravine, he found something else. Footprints. Not animal, human. Small feet, bare. Someone had passed through here recently. The ash in the footprints hadn't completely crumbled away yet. A few hours ago, maybe last night. Dan crouched down and examined the tracks. The stride was short and uneven. The right foot was placed more heavily than the left, a limp. The person was injured, walking slowly, and judging by the size of the foot, it was a teenager. He followed the tracks. They led along the ravine to the southwest. Half an hour later, the tracks turned toward the cliffs. Dan found her in a hollow beneath an overhanging rock. A girl, about 15, small and thin. Her hair was tangled. Her clothes were stained with brown blood. Her right leg was wrapped in a dirty rag soaked in something dark. Her thigh was swollen to twice its size. The skin around the wound was red and hot. Even from 2 paces away, Dan could feel the heat. Infection. Serious. 2 days without treatment, maybe 3. The girl lay unconscious. Her breathing was raspy and rapid. When he placed his fingers on her neck, her pulse was fast and weak. 120 beats. A fever. A dim number hung over her head. 34. Dan removed the rag from the wound. It looked bad underneath. A laceration on the outer side of her thigh. Deep. The edges were inflamed and swollen. Something white glinted in the depths. Bone. Not a fracture, a chip. Something had struck her with tremendous force and torn out a chunk of muscle. The wound wasn't stitched. It hadn't been treated, just wrapped in a dirty rag. Pus had already begun to accumulate. If it isn't opened and drained within 24 hours, sepsis will set in. And sepsis without antibiotics means death. Dan didn't hesitate. He went back to the ravine, gathered what he needed: a knife, a rope, a flint, a flask of boiled water, a piece of metal to use as a bowl. He went to the bushes with bitter leaves and gathered a handful. He returned to the ravine and found another tree, a living one, with flexible branches. He cut 2 straight sticks, each as long as his arm, for a splint. Then he found the carcass of the slain creature. He cut a strip of tendon from the hind leg, thin and strong, a thread for a suture. He returned to the girl. She was still unconscious. Good. That makes it easier. He lit a fire next to her. He boiled some water. He took off his shirt and tore it into strips. He singed each strip over the fire. He heated the knife. The blade glowed red from the heat. He let it cool. Now for the operation. He rinsed the wound with boiled water. The girl groaned but didn't wake up. He lanced the abscess with one precise movement. Pus gushed out, thick and yellow-green. The smell hit his nose. Dan rinsed and rinsed until clean blood flowed from the wound. Then he drained it. He left a narrow channel for drainage. He placed a piece of cloth, a strip of cloth soaked in a decoction of bitter leaves. If it really is salicylates, it will help with the inflammation. He sutured the wound with a tendon, 7 stitches, even and neat. Field surgery. Not pretty, but functional. He applied a splint to her thigh, 2 sticks on either side, wrapped it with strips of cloth, secured it. The girl was as pale as the ashes around her, but her pulse had slowed slightly. 110, already better. Dan brewed the bitter leaves in boiling water. He lifted her head, poured it into her mouth. She swallowed reflexively. He laid her back down, placed a rolled-up piece of cloth under her head, covered her with the remains of his shirt. Now to wait. Either her body would fight off the infection, or it wouldn't. He'd done everything he could. 8 hours had passed since he'd tasted the creature's meat. No symptoms, so it's safe to eat. Dan returned to the carcass. He cut pieces of meat from the thighs and back, skewered them on sticks, roasted them over the coals. He ate slowly and carefully. The taste was strange, tough and stringy, but nutritious. Protein is protein. He made broth. He covered the bones with water in a metal bowl and set it over the coals. An hour later, he had a cloudy liquid that smelled like boiled meat. He let it cool. He tasted it. It was passable. This broth was for the girl. She needed fluids and calories. He sat by her side all night. He added wood on the fire. He changed the compress on her forehead. He gave her a leaf decoction to drink every 2 hours. By morning, her fever had started to break. Dan checked the wound. The swelling had gone down. The redness had subsided. The drainage was working. The pus had almost stopped. She'll pull through. He sat down beside her and let himself breathe a sigh of relief. He looked at his hands, dirty, covered in dried blood, in ashes. Hands that had just pulled a person back from the brink of death with a piece of a rusty knife and strips of a shirt. He smiled. Somewhere at Fort Bragg Base, his field medicine instructor would have said that the technique was appalling, but the patient was alive, which meant it passed. On the second day after the operation, the girl opened her eyes. At that moment, Dan was sitting by the fire, cooking broth from the second lizard. He'd caught the first one with a knife, the second with a trap, a simple lever mechanism made of stones and rope. The creature had stepped on the loop and brought a stone slab crashing down on itself. Dan heard the girl stir. He turned. She was looking at him. Her eyes were cloudy from fever, but already focused. Then she looked up. She saw the number above his head. 999999991. Her eyes grew as big as saucers. She tried to crawl away. She cried out in pain from her leg and froze. Dan didn't move. He simply said calmly that she'd better not move because the stitches were fresh and he didn't want to have to re-stitch her. Then he asked her name. She was silent. She looked at the number, then at her bruised leg, then back at the number, then at the broth bubbling in a metal bowl over the coals. Her stomach made a sound louder than any answer. Dan poured the broth into a tin cup he'd found and held it out to her. She didn't take it. She asked who he was. Dan said his name was Daniel Carter and that he had no idea where he was or how he'd gotten there, but he knew how to make broth. She looked at him for another minute. Then she took the tin cup and began to drink. In small sips, her hands were shaking. When she had drunk half of it, she stopped and said her name was Lina. Lina Holt. Dan nodded. He asked if she remembered what had happened. Lina remembered. They had been brought in closed wagons, 20 people, all with low seals. They'd taken her straight from her cell in Velen Car, where she'd been serving time for stealing bread. Seal 34. By law, that's below the threshold of usefulness, subject to write-off. They were dumped on the edge of the Serin wasteland. They gave each of them a knife and a flask of water. They said it was a voluntary expedition to gather resources. No one believed them. On the very first night, the creatures came. Lina ran. Something struck her leg and she fell. She crawled to the rocks and lost consciousness. She remembered nothing else. Dan listened. Then he said that the other 18 were dead, that he had buried them. Lina fell silent for a long time. Then she asked why he hadn't abandoned her. Dan answered simply, because she was alive. That was reason enough. Lina looked at him as if he'd said something in a foreign language. Then she finished the broth. For the next 3 days, Dan cared for her while also setting up camp. He carried Lina to the clearing. He made her a bed out of dry grass he found in the ravine. He changed her bandages twice a day. He washed the wound with boiled water. He gave her a decoction of bitter leaves to drink. Lina started eating. At first, just broth, then meat. She grimaced at the taste but ate. On the 3rd day, her fever finally broke. The wound began to heal. Dan removed the drain. The stitches held. Lina sat up for the first time. She looked around the crevice. She saw neatly arranged items: a canteen, a knife, a rope, a supply of dried meat on a rock by the wall, a stack of scorched rags for bandages, a small hearth lined with stones. She said it looked like a home. Dan replied that for now it was just a den. A home was still far off. While Lina was recovering, Dan went out on reconnaissance, every day in a new direction. To the north, the cliff stretched for about 5 kilometers and ended in a sheer drop. Beyond the drop, a valley began, green. Not gray like the plain, but truly green. Trees, grass. Something glistened at the bottom of the valley, maybe a river. Dan made a mental note of it. If there was water and vegetation there, they needed to get across, but not with an injured girl in his arms. It was too soon. To the west, beyond a ravine lined with bushes, a forest stretched out. The trees were black and bare, like the first one he'd found, but something was growing between them. Mushrooms, large ones with gray caps. Dan didn't touch them. Mushrooms in an unfamiliar world were a gamble. Without a thorough check, it's not even worth trying. To the east, the plain stretched to the horizon, empty and dead. That's where they came from. There was no point in going back there. On the 5th day, Dan returned from scouting and saw that Lina was sitting by the fire, trying to cut the meat with a knife, with her left hand. It wasn't going well. The pieces were lopsided and uneven in size, but she was trying. Dan sat down next to her and showed her how to hold the knife, how to cut away from herself, how to secure the meat on the stone. Lina repeated the steps. It turned out better. Dan nodded and said that if she kept up this pace, in a week he'd make her head chef. Lina snorted. It was the first sound resembling laughter he'd heard from her. On the 6th day, he found tracks. Not animal tracks, human tracks. 3 pairs, adults, in shoes. The tracks led from the southeast toward the cliffs, fresh. Dan returned to camp. He told Lina not to make a sound and not to leave the crevice. He took a knife and followed the tracks. He found them an hour later. 3 people, 2 men and 1 woman. They were sitting in a hollow among the rocks, thin, dirty, haunted eyes, marks above their heads. 41, 56, 38, written off, just like the other 18, only alive. They saw Dan and pressed themselves against the rocks. Then they saw his number. The reaction was the same for all 3. Mouths open, eyes widen, bodies freeze. One of the men started to crawl away. Dan stopped, raised his empty hands, said he wasn't going to touch anyone, said he had a camp with a fire and water and food. If they wanted, they could go with him. If they didn't want to, he could show them where to find water. They didn't answer. They stared at the number. Dan waited. Then he turned and walked back. After 20 steps, he heard footsteps behind him. All three were following him, at a distance, like stray dogs that want to eat, but are afraid of being touched. He led them to the camp. Lina peeked out from the crevice and stared at them. Dan built a bigger fire. He put the broth on to simmer. He showed them where the water was. He showed them where they could sleep. The older man's name was Taro. He was 47, a former bricklayer, dismissed when his mark fell below the threshold after an illness. The second man's name was Keiji, 23 years old, a blacksmith's apprentice, written off for debts left by his dead father. The woman's name was Naomi, 31 years old, a former seamstress, written off after the factory where she worked closed, and her contract was transferred to a new owner who decided it was cheaper to write off the workers than to pay them. All three had the same story. They were people as long as they were useful. Then they became numbers, and then the numbers became too small. Dan listened. He nodded. He didn't interrupt. When they fell silent, he said one thing. He said there were no numbers here. More precisely, there were numbers, but they didn't decide anything. What matters here is who has skills and who is willing to work. Taro is a bricklayer. That means there will be walls. Keiji knows blacksmithing. That means there will be tools. Naomi can sew. That means there will be clothes. Each of them is worth more than any number above their heads. The three of them looked at him. Taro lowered his head and clenched his jaw. Keiji blinked rapidly. Naomi just started crying. Quietly, soundlessly. Tears streamed down her dirty cheeks and fell into the broth. She finished it anyway. That evening, the five of them sat around the campfire. Dan was grilling lizard meat on skewers. Dan turned the following week into a training camp, not because he wanted to be the leader, but because if he didn't teach these people the basics, they would die. It was simple. Lesson 1. Water. Dan gathered everyone at the stream he'd found at the bottom of the valley beyond the cliff. Getting there turned out to be easier than he'd thought. Taro had found a path along the rocky slope, wide and gentle. Perhaps people used to use it. The stream was shallow and fast-flowing. The water was clear. Dan scooped up a handful and sniffed it. Clean. But he showed them the procedure anyway. Fill a container, boil it, let it cool. Only then drink it. Keiji asked why if the water was already clean. Dan explained that things invisible to the naked eye could live in clear water. Tiny things. So small that thousands could fit on the tip of a needle. They get into your stomach and kill you from the inside. Boiling destroys them. Keiji looked at him as if he were crazy. Invisible killers in clean water. It sounded like nonsense. But Dan said it in the tone sergeants use when stating things that aren't up for debate. Keiji nodded. From that day on, everyone boiled their water. Lesson 2. Food. Dan explained the inspection protocol. Skin, lips, tongue, spit it out. Wait. He demonstrated using berries growing along the stream, small and dark blue. Rubbed one on his wrist. Nothing after an hour. Tasted it on his lip. Nothing after an hour. Put one on his tongue. Sour. No symptoms after 8 hours. Ate one. Alive and well after 24 hours. The berries are edible. He made each of them go through this process on their own with a different plant. Taro checked the roots of some kind of tuber. Edible after cooking. Naomi found a herb with a minty scent. Safe. Can be brewed. Keiji found mushrooms. They turned out to be toxic. 20 minutes after contact with his lip, a burning sensation began. Keiji spat for half an hour and didn't touch mushrooms without permission again. Dan told him that was a good lesson. A burning sensation on the lip is better than death in the stomach. Lesson 3. Fire. Not how to start it. Dan showed that on the first day, and everyone remembered. But how to maintain it, how to conserve fuel, how to build a hearth so the heat goes where it's needed and the smoke rises upward. Taro proved useful. A stonemason is a stonemason. He built a fire pit out of flat stones in half a day, with a chimney, with a shelf for dishes. Dan watched and nodded. The first sign that these people were capable of more than just survival. They were capable of building. Lesson 4. Traps. Dan showed 3 types: a noose on the trail, a lever trap, a pit with stakes. They set the noose by the watering hole in the valley. By morning, a creature was caught in it. Not a lizard like the first one, something like a rabbit, if a rabbit weighed 15 kilograms and had 2 rows of teeth. But after checking, the meat turned out to be edible, and even tastier than the lizard. They called it the 2-toothed one. Dan didn't object. On the 10th day after Lina's arrival, Dan announced they were moving. The crevice was a good temporary shelter, but 5 people in a space 3 by 1.5 meters is cramped, and in the valley beyond the cliff, there is water, there is greenery, there is game, and most importantly, there is a structure there. Dan found it during a reconnaissance mission on the 3rd day, a stone structure on a hill at a bend in the stream, walls as thick as an arm. The roof had partially collapsed, but 3 of the 4 walls stood firm. Inside, dust and debris, something like an observation post or a watchtower. Old, very old. The stones were hewn with a precision that spoke of skilled builders. Traces of symbols were visible on the walls. Not letters, symbols, almost completely worn away. Taro looked at the masonry and whistled. He said he'd never seen stonework fit so perfectly in his entire life. No mortar, no gaps. The blocks held together by their own weight and perfect shape. Whoever built this knew their craft better than any master in the cities. The move took 2 days. Lina could already walk with a cane, slowly and with stops, but on her own. Dan carried the supplies. Taro and Keiji carried stones for repairing the roof. Naomi carried bundles of dried meat and berries. They reached the building by noon on the 2nd day. Taro immediately set to work on the roof. Keiji helped. They found long branches from black trees and laid them across the collapsed corner. On top, they piled a layer of mud mixed with grass. Primitive, but it kept the rain out. Naomi set up the interior. She divided off sleeping areas. She stacked the supplies in a corner. She hung strips of meat to dry on a one under the ceiling. Lina sat at the entrance, sharpening a knife on a stone. Her movements were slow and confident. Dan had shown her how to do it 2 days ago. She'd picked it up on the first try. By evening, the structure began to resemble a dwelling. The hearth that Taro had built at the entrance was smoldering. It smelled of cooked meat and mint. 5 people sat inside eating soup made from 2-tooth fish and tubers. Lina said the soup could have been better. Naomi smiled. Taro grunted. Keiji asked if anyone here knew how to cook properly. Dan replied that he knew how to cook in a dozen ways if he were given salt. Without salt, only 14. Lina asked where they could get salt. Dan said that was an excellent question and that they would figure it out tomorrow. That night, he went outside. He stood on a hill near the building and looked out over the valley. The stream glistened in the dim light of the motionless sun. The wind rustled in the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a nocturnal creature cried out. But here, it was quiet. Dan looked up. The number above his head glowed dimly. 999999991. Salt was found on the 14th day. Dan walked along the stream downstream, alone, reconnaissance. 3 kilometers away, the stream flowed into a lake, small, about 40 meters in diameter. The water in it was murky and greenish. Dan approached the shore. He bent down. He sniffed. The smell was mineral and sharp. He wet his finger and licked it. Salty, very salty. He walked around the lake. On the far shore, he found white deposits on the rocks. Crystals, dirty, but it was salt. He scraped together a whole handful, then some more. He filled his pockets. He returned to camp with a look on his face as if he'd struck gold. Lina asked what was wrong with him. Dan poured the salt onto a rock. White crystals on the dark stone. Naomi gasped. Taro touched it and tasted it. Then he walked away silently and returned with a bag made from a piece of a 2-toothed beast's hide. Together, they went to the lake and gathered enough salt to last a month. The soup that evening tasted different. Lina ate in silence. Then she said it was the first time food had a taste rather than just calories. Dan nodded. Salt isn't a luxury. Salt is the foundation. Without it, the body loses minerals, muscles weaken, your head spins. Your heart starts beating irregularly. With salt, they can do more than just survive. They can live. The next day, Dan began building what he needed most of all, a water filter. The stream was clean, but Dan knew that sooner or later they would need to drink from other sources, from a lake, from puddles after rain, from whatever water they could find. He needed a charcoal filter. He explained the principle to Keiji. Keiji listened with his mouth agape. Dan talked about layers, sand, charcoal, gravel, more sand. Water passes through them and leaves dirt behind at each level. At the other end, it's cleaner than water from any well in the cities. Keiji asked where he knew all this from. Dan replied that he learned it in school. Keiji asked which one specifically, because at his school, they only taught him how to count money and bow to people with high seals. Dan smirked and said it was from a different school. They built the filter in 2 days. A hollow trunk of black wood, layers inside, a hole at the bottom. You pour murky water in from the top. Clean water flows out the bottom. Keiji poured in water from the lake, murky and green. It passed through the filter and came out clear. Keiji looked at it. He looked at Dan. Then he said it was witchcraft. Dan replied that it was physics. Keiji asked what physics was. Dan replied that it was magic that always works. On the 16th day, the first serious skirmish occurred. Dan was at camp, setting traps. He heard a scream, Naomi. He grabbed a knife and ran. Naomi was standing by the stream, with her back to the rock. In front of her was a creature, not a lizard and not a two-toothed, something new, the size of a horse, a long, elongated body covered not with armor but with something like bark, as if a tree had come to life and decided to become a predator. 4 legs as thick as pillars, a head without eyes, only a mouth, wide and studded with plates that looked like axes. The creature stood between Naomi and the camp. Naomi didn't move. That's right, Dan had taught them. If you encounter a predator and it hasn't attacked you yet, freeze. Don't run. Running triggers the chase instinct. Stand still and wait. Dan approached from the side. The creature turned its head toward him. The eyeless snout headed straight for him, so it can hear, or sense. Dan stopped. He assessed the situation. The creature was the size of a horse. A knife was useless against it. Even if he got right up close, he wouldn't pierce that hide. There was no trap, no pit had been dug. He wasn't ready. But Naomi was standing by the rock and couldn't leave. Dan made a decision. He picked up a rock and threw it at the creature. The rock struck its side. The creature turned around. It headed toward Dan, slowly, heavily. Every step pressed the grass into the ground. Dan retreated. He led it away from Naomi. The creature picked up speed. Dan ran. The creature ran after him, faster than he'd expected from such a massive body. He ran toward the cliff, toward the spot where the trail descended into the valley. The creature was catching up. He could hear heavy breathing behind him, the crunch of grass underfoot in waves. 20 meters to the cliff. 10. 5. Dan jumped to the side. The creature didn't have time to turn. Its momentum carried it forward. Its front legs went over the edge. The creature tried to stop. Its hind legs plowed into the ground, but its mass was too great. It flew down. 3 meters. A crash. A crack. A screech that cut through his ears like glass on iron. Dan crawled to the edge. The creature lay at the bottom. One of its front legs was twisted at an unnatural angle. The bark on its side had split, something dark and thick. The creature tried to stand. It couldn't. It whimpered. The sound was almost plaintive. Dan went down the trail. He walked around the creature. He found a crack in the bark. He drove the knife into the soft flesh beneath it, deep. The creature twitched and went still. He stood over the carcass. His heart was pounding. His hands were shaking. Adrenaline. He looked at the number, 999999991. He hadn't lost a single point, because the creature hadn't touched him. He'd killed it with tactics, not brute force. The instructor in him marked this as the right decision. Use the terrain, and use the enemy's mass against them. Don't engage in a fight you can't win. Naomi came down the trail. Her hands were shaking. Her face was pale. She looked at the carcass. She looked at Dan. She said he had saved her life. Dan replied that he had just thrown a rock and run. Nothing heroic. Naomi shook her head. Then she asked if they could eat the meat. Dan laughed. The first real laugh in this world. The wood creature's meat turned out to be inedible. Too much resin, but the bark, once dried, became hard as stone. Taro suggested using it to reinforce the walls. Bark shields, lightweight and durable. They skinned the carcass and dragged the plates back to camp. Keiji found something else useful in the tree creature. Teeth. Those very plate-like axes from its mouth. They were made of something harder than iron. Keiji ran one across a rock, and it left a deep groove. He looked at Dan with burning eyes. Dan understood. Tools. These teeth could be made into blades, axes, spearheads. It changed everything. Before this, they had one knife. Now they had enough material for a dozen. Keiji worked for 2 days, without a forge, without an anvil, without a hammer. A stone instead of an anvil, another stone instead of a hammer. He sharpened the creature's teeth, shaping them. An axe, 2 knives, a scraper, a spearhead. Rough, uneven, but sharp as a razor. When he finished the first axe and showed it to Dan, Dan took it in his hand and chopped a branch. The branch flew off as if cut by a laser. Dan looked at Keiji. He said that Keiji had just doubled their chances of survival. Keiji blushed and muttered that it was just teeth and a stone. Nothing special. Dan replied that nothing special is when you have a forge, but when you make an axe from a dead monster's tooth using 2 stones in the middle of nowhere, that's very special indeed. In the evening, they sat around the campfire, the 5 of them, with salty soup, with a new axe, with bark for walls, with a water filter. Lina was sharpening one of the new knives. She held it correctly, confidently, like someone who knows that a knife is a tool, not a weapon. Dan watched her and thought that 2 weeks ago she had been lying unconscious with a festering wound and Seal 34. And now she was sharpening a knife and in 2 hours would go check the traps herself, without reminder, because it's her job. He assigned it to her, and she accepted it. Taro sat and drew in the ashes with a stick. He was planning an extension to the building, a second room. Carter Post welcomed winter with a population of 112. Dan stood on the wall and counted the smoke. 23 houses, a smithy, an infirmary, a bathhouse, a grain storehouse, a meat storehouse, 2 wells. Jia's workshop, which everyone called a laboratory even though inside there was only a table and shelves with samples. Taro had finished the outer wall a month ago. Stone upon stone, 3 meters high, with turrets at the corners. Serin had posted a lookout on each turret. 4 shifts, around the clock. Inside the walls it was cramped but warm. People came every week, in pairs, in 3s, sometimes 10 at a time. Rumors of a settlement in the death zone spread across the continent like wildfire. An immortal healer with a billion-dollar fortune. A place where the written off aren't killed, but fed and taught. A place where the number above your head means nothing. For some, it was hope. For others, heresy. For still others, a threat. Dan knew that sooner or later, it wouldn't be refugees who came, but soldiers. He was preparing. Not for war, for defense. The difference is enormous. War is when you go to them. Defense is when you make it too costly for them to come to you. He taught people not to fight. He taught them how to prevent a fight from starting in the first place. Maggie O'Dare showed up in late fall, red-haired, freckled, with a gold tooth that sparkled when she smiled. And she smiled constantly. She arrived in a wagon loaded with sacks. The sacks contained medicine, herbs and powders and ointments that cost more in the cities than a bricklayer's annual earnings. Maggie was a smuggler. She hauled goods across the zone's borders along trails known only to her. Seal 670. She was proud of it. She said she'd earned every point with sweat and blood and a couple of broken noses. Not her own. Others. She pulled up to the Carter Post gates and shouted that she'd brought the goods and wanted to see the boss. Serin stepped out onto the wall and looked down at her. Maggie looked up at Serin. The 2 women sized each other up in 3 seconds, and both decided the other was dangerous. Dan came out to the gate. Maggie saw his figure and whistled. She said the rumors hadn't lied. Then she looked at him. A dirty work shirt, hands in the dirt, sweat on his forehead. He had just been digging a hole for a new cellar. Maggie said she had imagined the immortal healer differently. Dan asked how exactly. Maggie said at least in clean clothes. Dan replied that the clean clothes were in the wash, and that if she wanted to trade, she should come inside and show him the goods. Maggie went inside. She showed him the medicines. Dan examined every bag. He already knew most of the herbs from local equivalents, but 3 items were valuable. An antiseptic powder made from some kind of mineral, a fat-based pain-relieving ointment, and most importantly, seeds. Not medicinal ones, ordinary ones. Wheat and 2 types of root vegetables. Maggie said she'd found them in a ravaged village on the border of the zone. They were just lying around. Dan took the little bag of seeds and held it in his hands, so that Maggie understood it was worth more than all the other medicines put together. They made a deal. Maggie would bring the goods. Carter Post would pay with meat and salt and items made from the teeth of creatures that were listed in the policies as exotic materials for weapons. Fair trade. Maggie stayed for 1 night, then 2, then a week. She said she was waiting until the wagon was loaded for the return trip. But Dan saw how she looked at the infirmary where Lina was bandaging a wounded hunter, how she looked at the children playing in the yard, how she looked at Naomi, who was 3 women how to sew warm clothes from hides. Maggie watched all this with the face of someone peering through a window into a home and seeing what they'd never had. One evening, Dan found her alone by the fire. The others were already asleep. Maggie sat and stared into the flames. No smile, no gold tooth on display, just a 27-year-old woman who was tired of being alone. Dan sat down beside her. He was silent. After a minute, Maggie spoke. She told him about her brother, her younger brother. He was 14, an infection. A simple infection that could have been cured in a day if she'd had the money for a doctor. There was no money. The doctor refused. Her brother died in her arms. Ever since, she's been transporting medicine. For those who have no money, she sells it at a high price to the rich. She gives it away for free to the poor. And she hates every policy on the continent because in every one of them, there's a doctor who would turn away a dying child over a number. Dan listened. When she finished, he didn't say he understood. He didn't say he sympathized. He said that tomorrow he would start teaching her field medicine, everything he knew, so that next time she wouldn't need a doctor. Maggie looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. From that day on, she stopped talking about the return trip. Hae-yun arrived a week after Maggie, small, disheveled, wearing glasses on a string, with 3 notebooks under her arm. Seal 410. She hadn't been expelled, she'd been banished. The SEAL Academy in Velenkar had declared her a heretic for her theory. Jia believed that the seal of life was neither a blessing nor a gift from the gods. She believed it was a parasite, a symbiotic organism attached to every human from birth. It feeds on life force and returns a portion of it in the form of a number. The more it takes, the higher the number. But that's not the point. The point is that someone, at some point, created this parasite, and that someone decided who would get more and who would get less. The seal does not measure a person's worth. The mark measures how much they were allowed to have. When Jia presented this theory at the academy, they laughed at her. Then they fell silent. Then they expelled her. Then they declared her a criminal. Because if she is right, then the entire system of the polis, the entire hierarchy, the entire church of the mark, all of it is built on a lie. She reached Carter Post half dead, 2 weeks on foot through the outskirts of the zone, without food, without water, with 3 notebooks she didn't drop even when she threw away her shoes. Dan met her at the gate. She looked at his number. She wasn't scared. She wasn't surprised. She took out a notebook and began writing. Dan took her to the infirmary. Lina fed her. Maggie gave her ointment for her feet, which were rubbed raw. When Jia came to, she found Dan and said that his number was impossible, according to all known laws of the seal, and that she wanted to understand why. Dan replied that he wanted to understand too. They talked until morning. Dan told her about microbes, about bacteria, about viruses, about cells, about the immune system, about antibiotics, about vaccines. Jia listened, took notes, stopped him, asked for clarification, drew diagrams. By dawn, she had filled half a notebook and said that if even half of what he was saying was true, then the medicine of the polis was 1,000 years behind. Dan replied that it wasn't 1,000, 400. Jia smiled, for the first time in a long time. Dan built her a laboratory, a separate hut, shelves, a table, a window facing east for the morning light, a sign on the door, Office of Senior Researcher Hae-yun. Keiji had carved the letters into a piece of wood, neatly and precisely. When Jia saw the sign, she stood in front of the door and traced the letters with her fingers. Then she went inside and closed the door. Through the wall, you could hear her crying, quietly, like a person who had come home for the first time in years. Winter struck in the 3rd week of the 12th month. The temperature dropped so sharply that the water in the buckets froze overnight. The snow here wasn't white, it was gray, ash-colored. It settled on the walls and roofs of Carter's Post and made the settlement look like an old photograph from which all the color had been drained. Dan was preparing for winter from the first day of fall. Meat supplies, dried fish from the stream, root vegetables in the cellar, grain that Maggie had brought, firewood, lots of firewood. Taro had insulated all the houses with a layer of clay mixed with straw. Naomi and her 3 apprentices had sewn warm clothes from the hides of 2-toothed beasts and lizards. Rough, unrefined, but warm. They were ready. Almost. On the 4th day of winter, Hae-yun arrived. The 3rd princess of the city of Chongyong. She did not come alone. There were 7 with her. Servants who had fled with her, all with seals ranging from 200 to 950. Hae-yun herself had 950. She stood at the gate in a silk dress, completely unsuitable for winter in the death zone. Back straight, chin lifted, hands blue with cold. She shivering so hard her teeth were chattering, but she maintained her poise. A princess is a princess. Serin opened the gate. Hae-yun entered and looked around. Dirty walls, smoke from the chimneys, people in animal skins, children with smudged faces, the smell of manure from the pen with the 2-horned beasts that Lina had tamed for milk. Hae-yun looked at all this, and her face didn't flinch. Then she saw Dan. He was coming from the smithy, wearing a leather apron, his hands black with soot, his hair wet with sweat despite the frost, a number above his head. Hae-yun stopped. She knew about the number. Everyone knew. But seeing it with her own eyes was another matter. She did something Dan didn't expect. She bowed, deeply, the way one bows to a superior. Dan stopped. He said they didn't bow here. Here, they worked. If she wanted to stay, she needed to learn to do something useful. If she didn't, he'd give her food and show her the way. Hae-yun straightened up. She looked him in the eyes. She said she had been running for 3 weeks through the zone, that hunters had been sent after her, that they wanted to bring her back and marry her off to a lord 4 times her age to strengthen the alliance between the houses, that she'd rather die than go back, and that she was willing to do anything. Dan nodded. He took her and her people to the house for new arrivals. He fed them. He gave them warm clothes. The next day, he began teaching her. Hae-yun didn't know how to do anything. Absolutely nothing. She didn't know how to start a fire, didn't know how to fetch water, didn't know how to cut meat, didn't know how to sweep the floor. Her servants had done all that her whole life. Dan didn't laugh, didn't sigh, didn't pity her. He simply showed her, once, slowly, and waited for her to repeat it. Hae-yun repeated it, poorly, awkwardly, slowly. But she repeated it. She burned through her first 3 attempts to start a fire. She broke her first pot. She cut her finger with a knife on the very first day. Lina bandaged her finger and asked how she'd managed to live to 22. Hae-yun replied that until she was 22, she hadn't needed to live, just to exist. Lina fell silent, and she didn't tease her anymore. On the 5th day of winter, Dan put Hae-yun in the kitchen, not because a woman's place is in the kitchen, but because the kitchen is the only place where mistakes don't kill. Burnt bread isn't a burnt person. Hae-yun learned recipes. Dan showed her. how to knead dough, how to control the heat, how to tell when it was done by the smell and color of the crust. Hae-yun listened with the same attention she'd paid to the palace tutors, only now the subject was different. Not politics and not etiquette. Bread. On the 8th day, she baked her first loaf, crooked, burnt on one edge, raw in the middle. She placed it on the table and looked at it as if she had given birth to a child. Dan cut off a piece, took a bite, chewed for a long time, swallowed, said it was the best thing he'd eaten in a month. He was lying. The bread was terrible, but he saw Hae-yun standing over that crooked loaf and her hands were shaking. And he understood that for her, it wasn't just bread. It was the first thing in her life she had made herself. Not someone else for her, she herself, with her own hands. Hae-yun turned away and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Her hand was covered in flour. The flour got in her eyes, and it got even worse. Lina handed her a rag and said nothing. On the 12th day of winter, Dan left, alone, without explanation. In the morning, his bunk was empty. The leather backpack was gone. The knife, too. He hadn't told anyone where he was going or why. Serin was the first to notice he was missing. She checked the tracks by the gate. He had gone northwest, deep into the wasteland, toward territories where not even scouts ventured. Serin wanted to go after him. Lina stopped her. She said that if he left alone, then that's how it had to be. Serin looked at her. Lina held her gaze. Two women who both feared for one man and both knew they couldn't stop him. They waited. Everyone waited. The first day, the second, the third. A blizzard began on the third night. The wind tore off roofs. Snow piled up against the walls. Visibility dropped to 0. Maggie sat by the gate and peered into the gray haze. Jia didn't leave the lab. She wrote something down. Then she erased it. Then she wrote it down again. Hae-yun baked bread, a lot of it, loaf after loaf, her hands in the dough, her face focused. No one asked why so much. Everyone knew. On the 4th day, he returned, in the morning. The blizzard had died down an hour ago. The watchman in the tower shouted. Everyone ran out to the gate. Dan walked through the gray snow, slowly, staggering. His left arm hung limply. His face was frostbitten. His lips were cracked and bleeding, a sack on his back. He reached the gate. Lina rushed toward him. He pushed her away with his good hand. He made his way to the table in the common house. He took off the sack, untied the opening, poured out the contents. Seeds, handful after handful, wheat, carrots, turnips, something resembling beans, clean, alive, uncontaminated. He had found a cache, a preserved cache from an ancient civilization. He calculated the coordinates using the scraps of maps they had found at the observation post. 3 days' journey through the worst part of the wasteland, through the territory of the tree creatures, through the blizzard, with a frost-bitten hand and an empty flask. He sat down on the floor by the stove, leaned against the wall. He looked at the people around him. He said that next year they would eat their own bread, not store-bought, their own. Lina stood and looked at the seeds on the table. Serin stood in the doorway and looked at Dan. Maggie leaned against the wall and, for the first time in a week, wasn't smiling. Hae-yun held a fresh loaf of bread in her hands, and tears were streaming down her face. But this time not from the flour. Ji-ah stood with a notebook but wasn't taking notes. She was just standing there. Everyone was looking at him. At the man who had gone out into the blizzard alone to bring back the seeds. Not for himself. For the bread Hae-yun would bake. For the garden Naomi would plant. For the flour Taro would bake. For the future that begins with a tiny seed in the frozen earth. Dan closed his eyes. Lina sat down beside him and began to examine his hand. 2nd-degree frostbite. 3 fingers were swollen and darkened. She worked in silence, quickly, confidently. She applied a compress. She bandaged his hand. Dan didn't flinch. He trusted her hands. She had learned from the best. Maggie brought some pain-relieving ointment. Hae-yun brought hot broth. Serin brought a blanket. Jia brought a notebook and a pencil. She said that once he'd rested, she'd need a precise map of the route to the vault, because there might be other things there. Dan opened one eye. He looked at her. He smiled. He said that scientists were worse than commanders. At least you could tell commanders later. Jia replied that later he would forget the details. Dan closed his eye. He said he wouldn't forget. He had a good memory, and he fell asleep. The month of preparation for the expedition flew by like a single day. No, faster. Like a breath before diving into water, short and sharp. Every morning began the same way. Aiden woke up before dawn. He lay there for a minute. He listened to the academy. The old stones breathed, the pipes hummed in the wind. Somewhere on the third floor, a shutter creaked that no one had repaired in 50 years. Then he got up, washed his face, sat down at the table, and worked. Lists, routes, mana calculations. Every day brought them closer to the exit, and every day made that exit more terrifying. Not for him, for the 6 who would go with him. Lyra brewed potions, 23 vials. She worked in the alchemy workshop 14 hours a day. Aiden stopped by twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. In the morning, she stood over the distillation cube with eyes red from lack of sleep, stirring something in slow, circular motions. In the evening, she sat on a stool and labeled the finished vials. Her handwriting was small and precise, like someone who was used to saving space. Restorative potions, 7 of them, green, thick as honey. Each restored about a third of the average reservoir in 10 minutes. Protective, 5 of them, blue, liquid. They covered the body with a thin film that absorbed the first blow. 1 blow. After that, the film disintegrated and a new vial was needed. Painkillers, 4 of them, white, cloudy. They shut down the pain receptors for 2 hours. Side effect. After 2 hours, the pain came back all at once. All of it that had built up. Doubled. Use only as a last resort. 6 more vials with mixed formulas. For burns, for frostbite, for paralysis, for poisoning, for loss of consciousness, and 1 potion that stood apart from the rest, on the top shelf, behind a glass door. A potion for emergency dilation of the channels. Lyra brewed it on the 3rd night. She didn't sleep until dawn. Her hands were shaking as she sealed the vial. Aiden asked about the side effects. Lyra listed them calmly. 3 days of fever, a week of weakness, possible irreversible damage to the small channels in the limbs, possible partial loss of sensation in the fingers, possible cardiac arrhythmia. Aiden nodded. He said he hoped he wouldn't have to use it. Lyra looked at him for a long time. She said nothing. She knew he would use it. She hadn't made this potion for the first aid kit. She had made it for him. One night, Aiden walked into the workshop and saw Lyra standing at the table, crying. Quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her cheeks and dripped onto the tabletop. A finished vial stood nearby. The 23rd, the last one. She wasn't crying from exhaustion. She was crying because she was done. Because there was nothing left to brew. Because as long as she was brewing potions, she had a purpose. And now the work was done, and all that was left was to wait and think about what lay ahead. Aiden stood in the doorway. Then he quietly left. He didn't go in. There are some things you shouldn't interfere with. An alchemist's tears over the last vial is one of them. Sarah had prepared copies of the map for everyone. 7 copies. 1 main copy and 6 spares. She sat in the library for 12 hours a day. The table was piled high with parchments. Old ones, ragged ones. Some were 3,000 years old. The ink had faded so much that the letters had to be guessed. Sarah didn't guess. She compared. She took 1 parchment. She found an illegible section. Then she'd take another parchment from a different era and find the overlap. If 2 documents separated by a millennium described the same area, the illegible parts of one could be reconstructed using the other. The method was slow, painstaking. It required a memory capable of holding hundreds of small details at once. Sarah had that kind of memory. She reconstructed 3 erased sections of the map. Not perfectly, about 70%. But that was enough to keep from getting lost. She marked the dangerous zones, red dots, places where the silence might already have spread. Blue dots, places where magic might not work or might work differently. green dots, possible sources of water and shelter. Each map was folded in 4 and packed into a leather case treated with a water-repellent solution. Sarah thought of everything. She always thought of everything. It was her curse and her strength. On the 4th day of preparation, Sarah came to Aiden with a notebook. She opened it to the page with the calculations. She asked him about the speed of silence's spread. Aiden gave a figure, about 1.5 miles a month. Sarah wrote it down. Then she looked up, gray, behind her glasses. She asked quietly how much time they had left before the silence reached the nearest populated areas. Aiden paused. Then he answered, 4 months, maybe 5. Sarah nodded. She closed the notebook. She stood up. She left. She stopped at the door. She didn't turn around. She said that the maps would be ready in 3 days, not in a week. Aiden understood. She recalculated the timeline and realized they didn't have a week. Ayla trained until her fingers bled. Every morning she went to the academy's eastern courtyard. There was a patch of open ground there, 10 by 10 meters. No tiles, no stone, just dirt. Ayla sat in the center. She placed her palms on the ground and began. The connection to the earth required contact, physical contact. Her fingers had to feel every grain, every pebble, every root. She picked up stones, small ones, fist-sized ones, then bigger ones, then really big ones. Then she'd put them down, then pick them up again, over and over, hour after hour. The earth resisted, not because it was hostile, but because it was heavy. Heavy in the literal sense. Every stone she lifted drained mana from her. Every minute of contact sapped her strength. By noon, her fingers were rubbed raw and bleeding. By evening, she could barely move her hands. Aiden stopped her twice, the first time on the 3rd day. He stepped out into the courtyard and saw her sitting on the ground with stones flying around her, dozens of them, all at once. Her face was pale, blood was running from her nose, her hands were shaking. He said, "Stop." She didn't hear him. He walked over and put his hand on her shoulder. She flinched. The stones fell, all at once. A crash. Dust. She looked up at him. Her eyes were cloudy from overexertion. He said that broken hands were more useless than untrained ones. She wanted to argue. He could see it on her face. Saw how her lips tightened, how her eyes flashed. 13 years old, stubborn as the rock she was lifting. But she obeyed. Not right away. A minute later. She stood up, wiped the blood from her face, went to wash her hands. He stopped her a second time a week later. She was on her knees, pounding the ground with her fists. Not out of anger, out of despair. She couldn't lift the rock. The stones on the surface were obedient, but the rock, deep down, wouldn't yield. It was too old, too heavy, too stubborn. She pounded at the ground and cried, quietly, angrily. Aiden sat down beside her, silently. He waited until she stopped. Then he said one thing. He said that the earth is not an enemy. The earth is a friend who is too old and too heavy to move quickly. You must not command it. You must ask. Show it why. Show it what's above. Light, rain, tree roots, life. The earth loves life. It holds up the whole world. It wants to help. It just doesn't know how. Ayla looked at him, wiped away her tears. The next day she sat down in the yard again, placed her palms on the ground, closed her eyes, and didn't command. She asked, quietly, in a language that didn't exist, in the language of touch and warmth and intention. The rock beneath her stirred, deep, rocky. It didn't rise, but it stirred. Ayla opened her eyes and smiled. Aiden made her an amulet, 3 evenings of work. He chose a stone from the academy's foundation, not just any stone. A stone from the first layer of masonry, the one he himself had laid 10,000 years ago. A stone that had absorbed the manna of the first age, pure, unclouded. He carved a leaf out of it, small, no bigger than a thumbnail. He used only a knife, no magic. The shape had to be created by hands, human hands, warm hands. Then he carved a rune of protection. One of the simplest, 3 lines, 2 curves. He could have carved something more complex, more powerful. But complex runes require attention, activation, recharging. A simple rune works on its own, quietly, constantly, like a warm hand on your shoulder. It won't stop a 5th-rank spell. It won't save you from the void. But it will give you a split second, a warning. Warmth that turns to cold when danger is near. A split second that could save a life. He threaded the cord through the hole in the stone and came to Isla that evening. She was sitting in her room, bandaging her fingers. He handed her the amulet. She took it, turned it over in her hands, touched the rune, looked at him, asked what it was. He said it was a stone from the foundation, with a protection rune, so she would know when something was wrong nearby. Isla put the amulet around her neck. She touched the stone through the fabric of her shirt. It was warm. She smiled, not widely, just a little, the corners of her lips, and she never took it off again. Haley finished the complete construction of the fireball, 23 runes, all of them. She had been working on it for 2 months. Every evening after class, she went to the training ground behind the west wing. There were stone targets there, 5 of them, lined up in a row 20 meters apart. She stood on the line, raised her hands, and began to weave. Rune by rune, thread by thread. According to the Solveig family tradition, a fireball consisted of 6 runes. 6 runes delivered a bright, powerful blow, brutal, like a sledgehammer. 6 runes were simple. Any sophomore could master 6 runes in a semester. But Aiden showed her another way. 23 runes, each added a layer of control. The 7th rune, direction. The fire didn't go where you threw it, but where you wanted it to go. The 8th, temperature. You could adjust the heat from a warm breeze to white hot. The 9th, duration. The fire didn't flare up and die down. It burned for as long as needed. The point, shape. A sphere, a spear, a wall, a thread, anything. The 11th, density. Concentrated fire cut like a blade, diffused fire warmed like a furnace, and so on. Each rune was a new dimension of control. The 23rd rune was the last, the most difficult, the rune of feedback. The fire began to sense, not in a human sense, but it reacted to its surroundings. It flowed around obstacles. It found its target. It followed it. The fire became not a projectile, but a tool. Haley mastered all 23 in 2 months. By comparison, it took Aiden 3 years in his first life. But he learned without a mentor, and she taught him. Her fire became different, not bright and crude like the family canon, precise and deep, like a scalpel instead of an axe. She could light a candle from 30 meters away without singeing the wick. She could cut a stone target in half with a thin thread of flame without harming those standing nearby. She could create a wall of fire that let people through but not beasts. The fire obeyed her. It didn't submit, it obeyed. The difference is enormous. She tried to show her brother. Kyle came to the training ground one evening. He stood and watched. Haley showed him the complete formation. 23 runes, a thread of fire that carved Kyle's name into the stone. In even letters, without a single extra burn mark. Kyle looked. Then he said she was overcomplicating things. That 6 runes were enough for battle. That the remaining 17 were an academic whim. That their father had taught them differently. That the Solveig fire was about power, not precision. Haley listened. Then she said their father was wrong. Kyle fell silent. His face darkened. He turned and walked away. Haley stood there, watching his back. Aiden saw her face. Not anger, bitterness, heavy and deep as a well. She turned and left the training ground. She clenched her teeth, not from pain, from understanding. She couldn't save those who didn't want to be saved. Kyle was her brother. She loved him, but she couldn't make him see what she saw. 23 runes, a world where fire doesn't destroy but creates. A world where Solveig could be more than just a hammer. Hae-yun honed her runic blade technique. She trained in the courtyard, every day, from dawn until noon, then a break, then again until sunset. Her sword was ordinary, medium-hardened steel, nothing special. But in her hands, it became something else. The Steel Path, a school of combat that used internal mana instead of external. Mana flowed not through a mage's channels, but through a warrior's muscles and bones. Through different paths, rougher, slower, but more reliable. External mana could run dry. The reservoir could empty. Internal mana was bound to the body. As long as the body moved, mana flowed. As long as mana flowed, the sword cut. Hae-yun sliced through the air, quickly, precisely. Each strike left a thin silver trail in the air, a runic cut. Not physical, magical. It cut through not flesh but constructs, spells, barriers, shields. Any magical structure before her blade was a spider web. One strike, a tear. 2 strikes, destruction. She had become quieter over the past month, more focused. She used to talk a lot, comment, joke, sharp-tongued. Now she was silent, listening, observing. Something had changed in her. Not on the outside, on the inside. Something had become harder and softer at the same time. Aiden noticed it in the second week. He woke up in the night, 2 hours before dawn. He wanted some water. He went out into the hallway and saw Hae-yun. She was sleeping on the floor, right outside his door, on the stone floor, without a pillow, without a blanket, her sword nearby, within arm's reach. He stood over her and watched. She woke up instantly. She opened her eyes. She saw him. She didn't jump up. She wasn't embarrassed. She just looked. He asked her not to do this. He said she had a room, with a bed. She said it was her choice. Her voice was steady, without defiance, without submission, just a fact. He could have ordered her. She wouldn't have listened. He could have explained that it was an unnecessary sacrifice. She wouldn't have agreed. Because it wasn't a sacrifice. It was a decision. She decided that his life was more important than her sleep, and no words, no arguments, no logic could change that, because it wasn't about logic. It was about something else, something that had no name in the language they both knew. Aiden stood there for another second. Then he went back into the room. He lay down. He didn't fall asleep until dawn. The next night, he brought her a pillow and a blanket. He placed them by the door. He said nothing. She said nothing. From then on, she slept by his door on the pillow and under the blanket, every night, right up until the day he was released. Maeve had learned to heal deep wounds. 2 weeks ago, she knew how to heal scratches and make bruises go away. Now she was closing cuts down to the bone, setting sprains, reducing swelling. Her hands glowed with a soft green light when she touched damaged tissue. The light was warm and slightly damp, like morning dew. She worked slowly, intently, with an expression Aiden had seen only in one kind of person, in mothers. She spoke to the wounds, not aloud, inside, in a language older than words. She coaxed the tissue to close, asked the blood to stop, invited the skin to heal, and the tissue obeyed. The blood stopped, the skin tightened, not instantly, not like in fairy tales, slowly, millimeter by millimeter, but it obeyed. Lyra was her main patient. The restored channels ached, constantly, with a dull, throbbing pain that wouldn't let up day or night. Maeve came to her every evening, sat down beside her, placed her hands on Lyra's forearms, and worked. Half an hour, an hour. A green light enveloped Lyra's hands, and the pain receded. It didn't go away, it receded. For a few hours. That was enough for Lyra to sleep. Lyra didn't thank her. Not because she was ungrateful, because gratitude between them would have been superfluous. Something formal. There was a different bond between them, quiet and deep. The bond of two people who know what pain is and who help each other bear it. A week before the release, Aiden went down to the basement of the Carvel estate, alone. At night. He had left the academy after sunset, without telling anyone. Ji-eun woke up when he opened the door. She looked at him. He said he'd be back by morning. She wanted to go with him. He shook his head. She pressed her lips together. She lay back down, but she didn't fall asleep. He knew. He could feel her gaze on his back as he walked down the hallway. A 12-hour ride, on horseback, non-stop. The night was dark. The moon was hidden behind the clouds. The road south went through the forest, then through fields, then over hills. The horse knew the way, an old Carvel mare who had traveled this route hundreds of times. Aiden sat in the saddle and thought, not about the seal, about them, about the 6 of them, about Lyra, who brews potions and weeps at night over the last vial, about Sarah, who counts the miles and the days and knows there aren't enough days, about Isla, who pounds her fists on the ground and begs the stones to rise, about Haley, who showed her brother 23 runes and received indifference in return, about Ji-yi, who sleeps on the stone floor to be closer to his door, about Maeve, who talks to her wounds and pleads with them to close. 6 people who are going north with him, into the silence, from where he may not return, from where they may not return, and he is taking them there, because he cannot manage without them, and because they themselves decided so, each one, in their own way, for their own reasons. But they all decided the same thing. Let's go. He reached the estate by the pre-dawn twilight. The estate stood dark and empty. The servants had left. The windows were boarded up, the overgrown. The staircase to the cellar was covered in dust. No one had gone down there in months. He lit a small flame in his palm. Dim. Barely enough to see the steps. He went down. The cellar was cold and damp. Stone walls, a low ceiling. In the center stood a binding stone, a granite square, 1 meter by 1 meter. Runes on the surface, ancient ones. His runes. He had carved them 10,000 years ago. They still glowed, pale, like dying stars. He placed his palms on the stone. The stone was icy. The cold traveled through his skin, through his muscles, through his bones. It reached his heart. Aiden closed his eyes and read the message he had left for himself, 10,000 years ago, in another life, in another body. When his name was Alistair Vane, and he was the most powerful mage in the history of the world. The message was short, in a language of the first age. 3 sentences. The first, the seal will crack in 10,000 years. He knew. When he cast it, he knew. The seal was not eternal. Nothing is eternal, not even the magic of the first age. A crack will appear. Silence will seep in. The world will begin to lose color and sound and life, and it would be necessary to return. It would be necessary to repair what had been broken. He knew all this when he placed the seal, and he placed it anyway, because 10,000 years of life are better than none. The second phrase, to restore the seal, all 9 schools are needed, all of them, simultaneously. Fire, water, earth, wind, light, shadow, life, time, and the conjunction that binds all 8 into one. One mage is not enough. Even if it is Alistair Wayne at the height of his power, a chorus is needed. The voices of all the elements are needed, together, in a single moment. Otherwise, the seal will not close. The third phrase was the difficult. 3 words in the language of the first age. The anchor remains. Whoever seals the seal remains inside. Forever. Not for 9,000 years like last time. Forever. Because the crack is deeper than before. Because the silence is stronger. Because the world is weaker. Because there is less mana. The seal demands more than the first time, and the price for this is the anchor. The person who will stand in the center and cover the hole with their body, forever. Aiden took his hands off the stone. He sat down on the cold basement floor. He leaned his back against the wall. The stone was wet and rough. He sat like that until dawn. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He didn't weigh his options. He just sat there, because there was nothing to think about. The third phrase left no options. Someone had to stay, and that someone had to be him. Because only the creator of the seal knows the formula to close it. Because only he had been on the other side before. Because only he can endure the void. Last time, he spent 9,200 years there, in the void, without a body, without time, without sound, without light, without any memory of who he was. 9,000 years in nothingness. Then he was reborn, became a child, became Aiden Carvel, and began to remember. Slowly, piece by piece, rune by rune, 10,000 years of experience in a boy's mind. And now he must return. There, to nothingness, and this time, forever, without hope of rebirth, without a chance to return. He sat on the basement floor and stared at the ceiling. A spider web in the corner, a drop of water on a stone, a tiny spider crawling up the wall. The world was filled with details, small ones, insignificant ones, infinitely precious ones. The spider, the drop, the web, the cold stone beneath him, the damp air, the silence of the basement. Not that silence, the ordinary kind, human. The silence of a place where no one is. He thought about what it would be like, forever, without the drop, without the spider, without the stone, without the air, without them, without Sarah who reads and writes, without Lyra who cooks and cries, without Isla who asks for the earth, without Haley who found 23 runes, without Ji-yoon who sleeps by the door, without Maeve who talks to wounds, forever, without. He returned to the academy and told no one. He couldn't. If he told them, they wouldn't let him go. Lyra will find another way. Sarah will recalculate the formula. Isla will say she'll stay in his place. Ji-yoon will stand between him and the seal. Haley will burn everything around her. Maeve will try to heal the void itself. They'll look for a way out, waste time, argue, cry, cling to a hope that isn't there. And the silence will advance. A mile a month. Every day they spend searching for another way is 20 trees that will turn white, 10 birds that will stop singing, 5 streams that will fall silent. He couldn't allow that, not because he didn't want to live. He did, very much so. But he had already made that choice once, 10,000 years ago. And the world had lived for 10,000 years because of it. If it had to be done again, then so be it. The departure was set for dawn on the last day of the 4th month. 7. 7 bags, 7 pairs of legs. 1 route, north, into the silence. Aiden checked every bag personally. Hardtack, dried meat, a flask of water, spare clothes, a sheep's wool sleeping bag, a rope, a knife, a flint, a map in a leather case. Lyra has 23 vials on her belt, each in a separate pouch, each labeled, each in its place. Ji-yoon has a sword on her back and a short dagger on her hip. Haley has nothing but her hands. She needs nothing. Ayla has a blimp around her neck, warm, glowing. Nora came to see Ayla off. She stood at the academy gates. Early morning, fog. The light hadn't broken through the clouds yet. Nora stood straight, dry eyes. Her lips were pressed together. She hugged her sister, long, tight. She didn't let go for a minute, 2. Then she let go. Then she walked over to Aiden. She looked at him, long, from bottom to top. She was a head shorter than him. She said one sentence, bring her back. Not a request, an order. A little girl giving an order to a man who is 10,000 years old. Aiden nodded. He couldn't promise, but he could nod, and he nodded. They went out, 7 of them, through the academy gates, along the stone road to the north. Fog enveloped them on all sides, wet and cold. Their footsteps muffled on the wet stone. No one looked back. Everyone looked ahead, to the north, into the fog. The first 3 days of the journey passed without incident. The road wound through a rolling plain, fields sown with wheat, farms with smoking chimneys, villages where children played in the streets and dogs barked at passers-by. The world looked normal, alive, colorful, but Aiden sensed it. Every evening he lay down on the ground, pressed his ear to the grass, and listened. The silence came from the north, like a tide, slow, relentless, unstoppable. Every day it was closer, by a centimeter, by a meter, by a kilometer. He didn't tell the others about it. They knew anyway. Sarah could see it in. Lyra sensed it in the quality of the herbs they gathered along the way. With each passing day, the herbs grew paler, less fragrant, less alive. Ayla felt it through the earth. The earth was growing quieter. The deep vibrations she had learned to hear were fading. On the fourth day, they entered the dead forest. The boundary was sharp. One step in the living world, the next step in the dead. The trees here were black, not from fire, not from disease, from the absence of life. The trunks stood like columns, straight, bare, without bark, without moss, without lichen. The branches jutted out like bones, dry, fragile. They crumbled to dust at the slightest touch. The ground beneath their feet was gray, not ash, dust, fine and dry. It rose with every step and hung in the air without settling. There was little light, not because the trees blocked the sky. The sky here was gray. The sun broke through it as if through dirty glass. Dull, cold, not warm. Maeve placed her hand on the trunk of the nearest tree and pulled it away, instantly, as if from a red-hot iron. Only the opposite. Her face turned pale. Her lips trembled. She said the tree was hollow, not dead, hollow. There's a difference. A dead tree contains the remnants of life. Rot, decay, microorganisms, beetles, fungi. Death is part of life. A dead tree is full of life. But this tree was empty. Life had been sucked out of it, all of it, down to the last bacterium, down to the last molecule of water, down to the last carbon atom that was once part of a leaf. Emptiness, absolute, pure, sterile, worse than death, because after death, one can be reborn. After emptiness, nothing. Ji-yoon drew her sword, silently. In a single motion, the blade glinted dully in the gray light. Haley lit a flame in her palm, a quiet one, precise, 23 run. The orange light fell on the black trunks and cast shadows that were blacker than the trees themselves. Ayla lowered her hands to the ground. Her fingers touched the gray dust. She listened. The earth was silent. It didn't answer. For the first time in all their training, the earth was silent. Ayla bit her lip. She didn't cry. Sarah clutched her notebook with both hands, pressed it to her chest, like a shield. Lyra checked the vials on her belt. Everything was in place, all 23. She had counted them 3 times in the last hour. 6 people ready for battle, and one who knew that fighting here was useless. Silence is not an enemy. You cannot fight it. You cannot cut it with a sword. You cannot burn it with fire. You can't push it out of the ground. You can't heal it. You can't read in a book how to defeat it. Silence is absence, emptiness, a hole in the fabric of the world through which everything leaks away. It can only be filled, patched up, sewed shut, closed. And for that, a seal is needed. They crossed the dead forest in 2 days. No skirmishes, no attacks. Even the beasts had left this place. Nothing to feed on, nothing to kill. Only silence, real silence, acoustic silence. No birds, no wind, no rustling of leaves because there were no leaves. Even their footsteps sounded muffled, as if the forest were swallowing the sound, sucking it in, drinking it, like water. Their voices, too. They tried to talk during their first rest stop. The words came out of their mouths and were lost immediately. They faded, like sparks in water. They had to speak louder, then even louder. Then they stopped speaking. They walked in silence. Ayla walked beside Aiden and held his hand, her small palm in his, warm, alive. He didn't pull away, because her palm was the only thing warm and alive in this world, and because she was afraid. 13 years old, a dead forest, silence. Anyone would be afraid, she all the more so. She didn't show it. She walked steadily, didn't look back, didn't flinch. But she held his hand, and that was enough to understand. On the 6th day of their journey, they reached the Cairn Pass. The mountains rose from the mist like a wall, gray, lifeless, stone without moss, cliffs without birds' nests. The path led upward between two stone peaks, narrow, steep. The snow on the peaks had a strange hue, yellowish, like old bone, like old parchment, like old mana. Aiden knew that color. The snow had absorbed the remnants of mana from the air, crystallized them, preserved them. But the mana was dead, not active, not flowing, just frozen, like blood on a wound that had cooled and hardened. The mana was dying, right here, right now, right beneath their feet. There were 12 of them, dark robes, long and heavy, hoods pulled down over their faces. On each right hand, a silver ring with a crossed-out eye, a symbol Aiden knew, remembered, 10,000 years later. The Order of Silence. A secret organization he himself had helped create in the First Age, as a tool to control criminal mages, as hunters of those who used magic for evil. 10,000 years ago, they were the best of the best, guardians of balance, defenders of the world. Now they were hunting children. 12 figures stood in a semicircle on the pass, calm, waiting, positioned strategically, blocking the path, a cliff behind them, a wall to the right, an abyss to the left. Nowhere to retreat, nowhere to go around. A classic ambush, a textbook on tactics, page 27. Aiden wrote this textbook himself. In the center of the semicircle stood a man, not in a dark robe, in a white one, the white robe of the Church of Light, with a golden sun on his chest, with a staff in his right hand. A small flame burned at the top of the staff, a church flame, a ritual flame, a flame of pure light. Vorin Kale, master, inquisitor, heresy hunter. Aiden had heard of him. Sarah had told him. Vorin Kale had purged 3 provinces of underground conjunction mages over the past 10 years. 67 arrests, 14 executions, 0 acquittals. An impeccable reputation, an impeccable faith, impeccable cruelty. Aiden stopped. He raised his hand. The team behind him froze. He could feel them as clearly as he could feel himself. Hae-yun tensed, every muscle ready, hand on the hilt of her sword. Not yet, waiting. Haley lit a flame on both palms, quiet, precise. 23 run, controlled down to the last spark. Isla lowered her palms to the stones beneath her feet, pressed them down, waited for a response. The stones of the pass were old, silent, but not empty, not like in the dead forest. There was still life here. Maeve took a step back, not out of fear, to get a better view, to see everyone, to know who would need help first. Lyra placed her right hand on her belt with the vials. She clenched her left into a fist. She was counting. 23 vials, 7 people, 12 enemies, 1 inquisitor. The numbers didn't add up, no matter how she looked at it. Sarah stood motionless, watching. Her gray eyes behind her glasses moved quickly, counting, assessing. She saw the agents' positions, firing angles, distances, and she saw there was no chance. Vorin Kale stepped forward. One step, heavy, weighty. The step of a man accustomed to the world parting before him. Tall, thin, but not weak. A steel-like thinness. Muscular. A body trained every day for 40 years. Silver temples. The rest of his hair black, cut short. A face as if carved from stone. Cheekbones, chin, nose. Everything sharp, everything angular, wrinkles only around the eyes. And the eyes, cold, not evil, just cold. The eyes of a man who believes he is doing the right thing. And that is precisely why he is more dangerous than any villain. A villain knows he is a villain, and he doubts. A righteous man never doubts. He spoke. His voice was even, polite, like a judge reads a verdict. Without emotion, without pleasure, without regret, just facts. He said that Aiden Carwell is accused of the heresy of conjunction, of creating forbidden potions that violate the law of the pure schools, in teaching forbidden techniques within the walls of a licensed academy, in corrupting underage students through heretical practices. He said that under the laws of the Church of Light, each of these crimes carries a sentence of life imprisonment, for all of them together, death. He said that under the laws of the Order of Silence, the practice of conjunction carries the destruction of channels and exile. He said he was offering a peaceful surrender. He guaranteed the students' lives. The trial would be fair. According to the law, silence. The wind on the pass, cold, heavy, smelling of stone and snow with a yellow tinge of dead mana. Aiden listened. He looked at Vorin. He saw his channels, powerful, pure, wide. School of Light, the highest level, 7th rank, maybe 8th, a reservoir as vast as a lake. This man was a true mage, not a bureaucrat in a robe, a fighter, a practitioner. He could single-handedly tear down the academy's wall, could blind an entire squad, could create a barrier that neither fire nor steel could pierce. And behind him stood 12 agents of the Order, each at least 5th rank, each trained to kill mages, each armed with anti-magic artifacts, rings, amulets, suppression runes, an arsenal designed for a single purpose, neutralization. There were 7 of them against them. Aiden mentally ran through the situation. Him, a first-year's mana pool, a thimbleful of mana, knowledge that wouldn't fit in his head, let alone his body. He knew 1,000 spells, could cast maybe 2 of them, until complete exhaustion. Ayla, a 13-year-old girl, School of Earth, untrained, talented. But against the 7th rank mage, talent without technique is like a candle against the fire. Lyra, a woman whose channels were restored a month ago. The channels are fragile, new, like baby teeth. One serious blow and they'll crumble again. She's not a mage, she's an alchemist. Vials are not weapons. Maeve, a herbalist who, 3 months ago, couldn't cast spells consciously. School of Life. She knows how to heal. She doesn't know how to maim. Maybe she can support the others, if she stays conscious. Sarah, librarian. No combat experience, no combat magic. She knows runes, knows the language of the First Age, can read ancient texts, but reading texts won't save you from a fiery blow to the chest. Hae-yun, swordswoman, the steel path. She's dangerous, very. One-on-one, she'll take down any of the 12 agents, but not all 12, and not with an inquisitor at her back. Haley, a 16-year-old aristocrat, dual affinity, fire and shadow, 23 runes. She is strong, perhaps stronger than she thinks, but 2 months of training against Vorin's 40 years of combat experience, the odds were deadly. Aiden stepped forward. 1 step, 2, 3, 4, 5. He stood before Vorin, 4 meters between them. He looked him in the eyes, from the bottom up. A 15-year-old boy and a 55-year-old man. The body of a teenager and the experience of an ancient one, a thimble and an ocean. Aiden felt no fear, not because he was brave, because he was old. 10,000 years. Fear was a familiar feeling, an old friend. He had long since learned to greet it and move on. He spoke, quietly, calmly, a boy's voice, the words of an old man. He asked Vorin if he knew why mating was forbidden, not by law, in reality, not the letter of the code, the real reason. Vorin answered immediately, without hesitation, like a man who had answered that question 1,000 times. Mating is a perversion of the pure schools. It destroys the natural order of magic. It is unstable, dangerous, unpredictable. A mage mated is uncontrollable. A mage mated is dangerous to those around them. A mage mated killed his sister 20 years ago. Vorin spoke the last sentence in a different voice. Not even, not judicial. Alive, hoarse. The voice of a man who still feels the pain. 20 years, and it hurts as if it were yesterday. Aiden heard that pain, recognized it, because he knew the pain of loss better than anyone on this pass, because he had lost people by the hundreds, by the thousands, 10,000 years of loss. Aiden nodded, slowly, with respect. He said he knew about his sister. Voren flinched, his whole body, as if struck. His eyes narrowed, his hand on the staff turned white. He asked how the boy knew. His voice was no longer polite, a dangerous voice, the voice of a man on the edge. Aiden replied, not quickly, weighing every word, checking every sentence for its weight, because the wrong word meant a fight, and a fight meant death, not his, theirs, the 6 people behind him. He said that Voren's sister wasn't a victim of the bond. She was his apprentice. A pause. Voren didn't move. Only his Adam's apple twitched. He swallowed. Aiden continued. He said she had studied the bond in secret, underground, without a mentor, without the proper texts, without protection. Fire and life. 2 schools that together produce a healing flame. She wanted to create a spell that heals burns, not just heals, restores completely, without scars, without pain, without a trace. She had dreamed of this since childhood, since the day she saw a burned boy on the street in their town, a boy they couldn't heal, because the school of life heals tissue, not burns, and the school of fire creates burns, not heals them, and only together, only through conjunction, only through the forbidden, cursed, heretical mating could a fire be created that heals instead of burning. She was close to success, very close, but her teacher, who had been taught using flawed methods, made a mistake in the key rune. 1 rune out of 23, the 20th, the rune of feedback. He inscribed it in reverse, not maliciously, out of ignorance, because the correct form of the rune had been lost, because the Church of Light had burned all texts on conjunction 300 years ago, because the knowledge had been destroyed. And what remained in the underground was fragments, distorted, incomplete, dangerous. The conjunction spiraled out of control, not because it is evil, not because it is unstable, not because it is cursed, because the knowledge was incomplete, because the rune was mirrored, because the church banned its study and drove practitioners underground where there were no proper mentors, where there were no proper texts, where there were no safe conditions. The church did not protect his sister. The church killed her by forbidding her to learn properly. Voren stood motionless, a stone in the wind, his face white, whiter than his robes, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles protruded through his skin. Aiden saw the cracks, saw 20 years of convictions shatter, one by one, small cracks in the wall that Voren had been building ever since the day he found his sister's body. A wall of hatred, of guilt, of the pain he had forged into righteousness. A wall behind which he had hidden the truth, that he hadn't protected her, that he hadn't found out in time, that he hadn't asked why she sat over her books at night, why she had burn marks on her fingers, why she smiled when she spoke of fire. He didn't ask, and then it was too late. And then he decided that the bond was to blame, and he devoted 20 years of his life to destroying everything connected to it. 67 arrests, 14 executions, 20 years of hunting, 20 years of running from the truth. But Voren was strong. The strong break more slowly. He gathered himself, clenched his teeth, took a deep breath through his nose. He asked in a voice that carried the chill of winter, how did the boy know such details? How did he know about his sister, about her teacher, about the rune, about the 20th of the 23, about the mirror error? It was a closed case, an order report, classified. Even he, Voren Kale, Master Inquisitor, had not seen the full report. Where from? Aiden raised his hand, slowly, very slowly. Voren tensed. The staff swayed. The flame on the pommel grew brighter. 12 agents behind him leaned forward. 12 hands reached for their weapons. Hae-yun, behind Aiden, took half a step, sword in hand. Haley raised the temperature of the flames on her palms. The air trembled. But Aiden didn't attack. He traced a rune, in the air, with the tip of his index finger. 1. Small. Line by line, curve by curve, The rune of conjunction, fire and life. The complete form, 23 elements. The very one Sister Vorin had tried to create on the day of her death. But this one was correct, without error, without the mirror defect. The 20th element in its place, perfect, precise, just as it was intended, 10,000 years ago, when Alistair Vane founded the 9th School of Magic. The rune flared, with a soft light, golden and green at the same time, warm, alive. A light that didn't blind but warmed, that didn't burn but healed. The light hung in the air between Aiden and Vorin, small, the size of a fist, pulsating, like a heart. Then Aiden directed the rune at the candle, at the small flame atop the tip of Vorin's staff, ecclesiastical, ritual, a symbol of pure faith. The flame changed, slowly, like dawn. Orange turned to yellow, yellow turned to white, white turned to blue, blue turned to indigo, even, cool, calm, not burning, healing. Exactly as Elira Kale had wanted to make it. Vorin's sister, 20 years ago, in the room that became her grave, exactly as it was meant to be. Vorin watched the flame, blue, quiet, dancing at the tip of the staff. Small, fragile, beautiful. He watched, and Aiden saw. He saw something breaking inside him. Not his faith, a wall. That very wall, 20 years old, stone, impenetrable. The wall he had built so he wouldn't feel, so he wouldn't remember, so he wouldn't see his sister who sat up nights poring over formulas and dreaming of saving the world. The wall behind which he had hidden his grief and called it righteous anger. The wall was crumbling, not all at once, not immediately, but the cracks were spreading, stone by stone, brick by brick. The blue flame at the tip of his staff was a hammer, small, quiet, irresistible. Voron asked hoarsely, one word, where from? Not where you know from, just where from. Where is this flame from? Where is this rune from? Where is this boy from? Aiden answered. His voice was quiet, steady, without defiance, without triumph, without celebration, because his sister's teacher was a student of a mage, who studied under a mage, who studied under a mage, who studied under a mage, 5 generations back, a line of knowledge transmission, distorted, fragmented, having lost key details, having lost the 20th rune, because in every generation the knowledge was cut short, because of the ban, because of fear, because of persecution. Every teacher knew less than the one before. Every student lost another piece, until only 6 runes remained out of 23, and the wrong 20th. The conjunction did not kill Elira Kale. The one who forbade her from learning properly killed her. The Church of Light, the Order of Silence, a system that turned knowledge into a crime and doomed practitioners to error. Silence, long, heavy, wind on the pass, snow with a yellow tinge, dead mana. 12 agents awaited orders. Vorin stood and watched the blue flame. It burned steadily. It didn't flicker. It didn't flicker. It just burned, small and eternal, like a memory, like a promise. Like the dream of a 16-year-old girl who wanted to treat burns and died because they wouldn't let her study. A minute, 2, 3, wind, snow, stone, flame, silence. Then Vorin slowly lowered his staff. The tip touched the stone. The sound was quiet, the tap of wood against stone. But it sounded like thunder, because an inquisitor's lowered staff is not a gesture. It is a decision. It is 20 years of life that have just ceased to have meaning, 67 arrests that were mistakes, 14 executions that were murders, 20 years of hunting a phantom that turned out to be his dead sister's dream. Vorin turned to the agent, slowly, heavily, like a man carrying a weight greater than his own body. He said one word, retreat. The senior agent stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, a ring with a crossed-out eye on his right hand. His voice was cold and businesslike. He said that the order did not answer to the church, that they had their own orders, their own charter, their own authority, that the practitioner of the union was subject to destruction under paragraph 14 of the Charter of Silence, that the Inquisitor's opinion was not binding. Voron turned to him, and for the first time in the entire conversation, something other than coldness appeared in his voice. Rage. Quiet. Deep. Terrifying. The rage of a man who had just realized that for 20 years he had been killing the wrong people, and who was directing that rage where it should have been directed from the very beginning. He said that if the Order touched these children, these 7, then the Church of Light would learn that the Order of Silence exists, officially, publicly, with documents, with names, with the addresses of their bases, with a list of operations. He, Voron Kale, would personally deliver these documents to the Cathedral of the First Ray. He knows where the Order keeps its archives. He worked with them for 10 years, and he knows what happens to secret organizations that cease to be secret. The agent froze. The face under the hood was indistinguishable, but the body froze. He looked at his own people. 12 gazes from beneath 12 hoods. Silence. Calculation. 1 Inquisitor, 7 children. Is it worth risking the entire Order, the entire structure, the entire 1,000-year-old network, for the sake of 1 boy with a thimbleful of mana? 1 decision. They retreated, silently, like shadows, just as they had come. 12 figures dissolved into the gray stone of the pass, as if they had never been there. Aiden knew they would return. Not now. Later. When Voron wasn't around. When they regrouped. Counted their losses and gains. And returned. But not now. Now the pass was empty. Voron turned to Aiden. Looked at him. For a long time. From head to toe. A man and a boy. But something in his gaze had changed. He was no longer looking down on him. He was looking. Just looking. As an equal. As one human being to another. Then he spoke, quietly, without politeness, without formality. He said he didn't know who he was, didn't know how old he was, didn't know where he came from, didn't know how a 15-year-old boy could know a rune that no one else knew, didn't know how a 15-year-old boy could have the voice of a 10,000-year-old man. But he would remember that flame, blue, quiet, his sister's flame, the flame she wanted to light but didn't have time to. And if the boy is right, if the bonding can be done correctly, if it can be taught to him safely, if it can be turned from a curse into a cure, then he, Voron Kale, wants to see it, someday, when the world is ready for it, when the church is ready for it, when he himself is ready for it. Aiden nodded, silently, without words. Words would have been superfluous. Voron turned around. It was hard, like a man turning his back on his entire former life. He walked away, down the path, south, without looking back. A white robe flashed against the gray stone and vanished. The pass was empty. Wind, snow, rock, silence. The team stood behind Aiden. 6 people, alive, unharmed. Not a single blow, not a single wound, not a single spell. He had won the battle without a fight, with words, with truth, with a blue flame on a stranger's staff. Hae-yun sheathed her sword, slowly. Click, click. Haley extinguished the flame. Her fingers trembled, not from the cold, from tension. She had held 23 runes in combat mode for 12 minutes. It was her record. She didn't know it was a record. She hadn't been counting. She'd just been holding them. Isla released the stones. She stood up. Her legs were shaking. Maeve lowered her hands. She exhaled. Lyra released the belt with the vials. Not a single one had been used. Sarah stood next to Aiden. The wind ruffled her hair. Dark, straight. She didn't brush it away from her face. She looked toward the horizon, toward the north, toward where the agents had gone. Then she turned to him and finally asked the question that had tormented her since her first day in the library. Since the day a 10-year-old boy entered the rare book vault and read a text in a language no one knew. She asked how old he really was. Aiden looked at the horizon, northward, toward the Valley of Silence lying beyond the mountains, toward the seal that awaited him, toward a place from which he might never return. The wind blew in his face, cold, with a hint of dead mana. He answered quietly, enough to tire him, not enough to make him stop. Sarah paused, then she nodded, She opened her notebook. She wrote something down. She closed it. She pressed it to her chest. They walked on, northward, into the silence. 7. 7 pairs of feet on dead stone. 7 shadows on gray snow. Northward. The valley of silence was white, not from snow, from emptiness. The grass was white, every blade, every stalk, white. Not gray like in the dead forest, white. The color was gone, completely, as if someone had taken the world and wiped the paint off it. The earth was white, the stones were white, the sky above the valley was white, uniform, without clouds, without sun, without a horizon, just white. Light came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. There were no shadows because there was no source. There was no direction because everything was the same. Mana was the world's paint, the energy that gave everything form and color and sound and smell. Without it, the world became a sketch, an outline, a sketch without shading, white on white. Aiden walked ahead. Each step was harder than the last, not physically, magically. The reservoir was weakening. Mana was leaking from it, constantly, unceasingly, like water from a leaky bucket. No, worse, like blood from a wound that won't close. The silence was drinking it, greedily, relentlessly. It was drinking mana from everything, from the earth, from the air, from the stones, from them. Every step cost mana, every breath cost mana, every thought cost mana, because mana was life, and silence drank life. Maeve faltered first. At the end of the first hour, her reservoir was enormous, an ocean of mana, wild and deep. The school of life gave her more mana than any other school, because life was tied to the very essence of existence. But that was precisely why silence drank from it more greedily. Life was the most delicious dish on the table of emptiness. Maeve turned pale. She swayed. She grabbed onto Lyra. Her hand clenched the sleeve. Her fingers were white. Lyra caught her. With one hand, with the other she took out a vial. Green, thick, restorative potion. Number 3, the first of 7. Maeve drank it. In 2 gulps, color returned to her face. Pink on her cheeks, red on her lips, green in her eyes. But not for long. 20 minutes later, the pallor returned. Silence continued to drink. Lyra counted. 7 vials, 20 minutes each, 140 minutes, 2 hours and 20 minutes. They wouldn't make it to the seal in 2 hours and 20 minutes. She recounted, added painkillers, protective ones, anything that could give even a drop of mana. It still wasn't enough. She pressed her lips together, didn't say a word, carried Maeve on. Haley walked with burning palms. The fire was the only color in the white world. Orange, alive, trembling. It came harder to her with every step. The runes demanded mana. Mana was draining away. The fire was fading. She poured in more power. The fire flared up and faded again. But she didn't extinguish it. She couldn't, because without the fire, without the external flame that occupied her channels, the shadow, the second school, the one inside, was beginning to stir. Silence wasn't just drinking mana. It was upsetting the balance. Fire and shadow within Haley were like the 2 ends of a seesaw, equilibrium, fragile, precise. When silence drank mana from fire, the seesaw tilted. The shadow grew heavier, stronger, hungrier. The shadow wanted out, wanted to fill the void, wanted to become everything. And if Haley extinguished the fire for even a second, the shadow would break free. And Haley would become someone else. Not Haley, something else. She held on to the fire, gritting her teeth, with tears on her cheeks. The tears were hot, from the fire, and salty, from fear. Hae-yun walked steadily. Her steel path did not depend on external mana. Internal mana flowed by different laws, not through a mage's channels, through muscles, through tendons, through bones. Silence reached out to her. It tried, but it couldn't reach her. Internal mana was too deep, too tightly bound to the body. To drink it, one would have to drink the body itself. Flesh, blood, bones. Silence did not know how to drink flesh. Not yet. Hae-yun walked beside Aiden, between him and the world, as she had promised, as she had decided. Sword in its sheath, hand on the hilt, eyes on the white horizon. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence spoke for her. I am here, between you and everything else. Isla pressed the amulet to her chest. The stone leaf was warm from the rune. The warmth pulsed, slowly, steadily, like a second heart. She whispered to the earth, not with words, with touches. Feet on the white earth, fingers on the white stones. She asked the earth to hold on. Asked not to give up the last. Asked to remember. And the earth beneath her feet answered, faintly, barely perceptibly, a vibration on the edge of sensation. But it answered, even here, even in the silence, because the earth remembered. The earth always remembers. It remembered the trees that grew here, the grass that was green, the roots that drank water, the stones that warmed in the sun. It remembered color, and as long as it remembered, silence could not take the last. Sarah walked in silence. The notebook pressed to her chest, the map in her head. She counted her steps, checked her bearings, a rock shaped like a bird's head, 2 stones, one on top of the other. The dry bed of a stream that once flowed from here to the south. She silently led them through the white void, a navigator, an anchor, a quiet, unobtrusive center around which everything held together. Without her, they would have gotten lost within the first hour. Because in the white world, there are no directions, no landmarks. Everything is the same. But Sarah could see. Her gray eyes behind her glasses could distinguish shades of white that others didn't notice. A slightly warmer white meant a rock beneath the surface. A slightly colder one meant emptiness. A slightly pinkish one meant remnants of mana. She read the white world like a book, page by page, step by step. They walked for 2 days through the valley, without sleep. They tried to stop for the night, but there was no night. The white didn't change. It didn't get dark. It didn't get lighter. Time didn't move here, or it moved differently. Sarah's watch stopped an hour after they entered the valley. The hands froze. She kept track of time by her pulse. 60 beats per minute. She counted. 1 hour, 2, 3, no fire. Haley held hers, but it didn't warm her. Not in a physical sense. It didn't warm her soul. Because the fire in the silence looked like the only living color in a dead painting. And that made it not warmer, but scarier. Because it emphasized the scale of the emptiness. A tiny flame in endless white, like a candle in an empty cathedral. Silent. The silence swallowed everything. Voices, footsteps, breathing. Even a heartbeat sounded muffled, distant, as if from underwater. They stopped talking by the end of the first day. Not because there was nothing to say, because words dissolved into the air. They didn't reach their destination. They had to shout to be heard at arm's length. And a shout here sounded like a whisper, and a whisper sounded like nothing at all. At the end of the second day, they saw the seal. It stood in the center of the valley, where the white was whitest, where the emptiness was emptiest. 12 pillars, of stone, huge, 3 times a man's height, each as thick as 2 arms could encircle. Gray stone, not white, gray, the only color besides the fire of Haley. The pillars stood in a circle, evenly spaced, 12 points on the face of a clock that stopped 10,000 years ago. Between the pillars, emptiness, not air, emptiness, black, absolute, not dark, black, exactly. A color in which there is nothing, not even darkness. A chill emanated from it, not frost. Frost is a temperature, it's physics, it's something. But from the emptiness came the absence of something, the cold of absence, the cold of a world in which there is nothing. No heat, no cold, no light, no darkness, nothing. Aiden approached the seal. He placed his hands in the nearest pillar. The stone was icy. No, the stone had no temperature. It was neither warm nor cold. It was empty, like the trees in the forest. Silence had drained almost everything from it. The runes on its surface barely glowed, pale, dying. Of the 23 runes on each pillar, only 4 glowed. The rest had gone out. 19 dead runes on each of the 12 pillars. 228 dead runes. 228 holes in the wall that had held the world together for 10,000 years. The crack ran through the entire base of the circle, wide, deep. Darkness oozed from it, thick, slow, like tar, black tar from nothing. He turned to the team, 6 faces, tired, pale, frightened, but standing, all 6. Not a single one had fallen, not a single one had given up, not a single one had asked to go back. He looked at each one, at Sarah with her gray eyes and the notebook she wouldn't let go of even here, at Lyra with her belt and hands that trembled from the pain in the channels, at Isla with the stone tablet on her chest, 13 years old, the white world, a white face, but standing firm, at Haley with fire in her palms. Fire was the only color, the only life. She had held it for a day, without a break. At Ji-yoon with a sword, calm, steady, like a pillar, like a stone, like a seal. At Maeve with a green glow in her fingers. The glow was dim, almost invisible. Silence was eating away at it, but it held, like Maeve, like all of them. He explained the plan. The seal requires 9 schools, all 9, simultaneously. Fire, water, earth, wind, light, shadow, life, time, conjunction. They have no water mage, no wind mage, no light mage, no time mage. 4 schools missing, out of 9. It would be impossible, for any mage, for any choir, for any ritual. But they have him, Alistair Vane. 10,000 years, all 9 schools in one mind. And they have conjunction, the 9th school, which exists to weave the impossible from the possible, the missing schools from those that exist. He explained, quickly, clearly. To each their own role. Haley, fire. Her 23 runes would form the foundation for 2 schools. Fire on its own, and light through the union. Because light is fire purified of destruction. Fire without heat, without burns, pure energy. Haley nodded. Her eyes were dry. The tears had dried up. Only determination remained. And one more thing, Shadow, her 2nd school. The shadow she feared, the one she kept on a chain. Shadow would become the foundation for time, because time is shadow superimposed on light. The moment when the past and the future exist simultaneously. Haley closed her eyes, opened them, nodded, not with words. Ayla, earth. Her school would provide the foundation for water, through deep currents, because deep underground there is water. Always, everywhere, even here, even in silence. The earth remembers water. If Isla asks the earth to remember, the earth will show the water the way up. Isla pressed her hands to the ground, closed her eyes, whispered. The earth trembled, slightly, but it trembled. Isla opened her eyes, nodded. Maeve, life. Her school will become a bridge for the wind, through the breath of the world, because the wind is that breath. Life breathes. Every living thing breathes. Every breath creates wind. Microscopic, invisible, but real. If Maeve breathes life into a dead valley even for a second, even into a single blade of grass, that blade of grass will exhale, and that exhalation will become wind. Maeve nodded, her hands in green light, dim but alive. Ji-yoon, perimeter. Her blade will cut down any void that tries to break through the crack while they work. The crack is open, wide, and there is something inside, something that sensed their presence, something that has awakened. Ji-yoon drew her sword. She stood by the crack, feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, blade held before her. Stance number 1, basic, timeless. She was ready. Sarah, voice. The runes on the pillars are activated by voice, in the language of the first age. Because the runes were created in that language, they remember its sound, and respond only to it. Sarah knew the language, not fluently, not freely, but enough. She would read each rune aloud. Every word would be a key, every syllable an activation. She clutched the notebook, opened it, found the page with the phonetic transcription of the runes they'd compiled together with Aiden 2 weeks ago. Lyra, support, potions. Every minute, every sip counts. She would run between them. Haley's vial when the fire began to die down. Maeve's vial when the green glow dimmed. Aile's vial when the earth stopped responding. She would keep them afloat, with potions, with words, with touches. 10 years in the dark, 10 years of pain, 10 years of loneliness. They taught her one thing: to know when a person is at their limit, to sense the moment when the body gives in, and to give just enough to hold on for another minute. One more. Because every minute could be the last, and every minute could be the first. And he, Aiden, Alistair, he will stand in the center of the circle and weave, the conjunction. 9 schools in 1 chorus, 4 real and 5 virtual. He'll spend everything he has, every drop of mana from his thimble, every rune in his memory, every second of his life, every memory, everything, without reserve, to seal the pact. He didn't tell them about the third phrase of the message, about the anchor, about the fact that someone has to stay, be left behind. He couldn't. Not here. Not now. Not before they begin. Because if he says it, Lyra will drop the vials and stand between him and the void. Sarah will slam her notebook shut and start looking for another formula. Ayla will cling to his arm and not let go. Haley will burn the pillars. Hae-yun would hack him down to keep him from entering. Maeve would try to heal the void. They would do everything. Everything except what was needed. And the seal wouldn't close. And silence would devour the world. They stood in a circle, each at her own pillar. 6 people at 6 pillars. The other 6 pillars were empty. But that doesn't matter. The conjunction will fill them. Aiden is in the center, on bare stone, on white earth, before the black void. He took out a vial, a potion for emergency channel expansion. Glass, small. The liquid inside is red, dark, thick. He looked at it for a second, 2, then he drank it. In 1 gulp, the liquid burned his throat, like acid, like molten metal. The channels flared with pain, all of them, at once. Every channel in his body, thousands, tens of thousands. They expanded, with a jolt, roughly, as if someone had taken narrow tubes and torn them apart from the inside. The reservoir tripled in size in seconds. From a thimble to a glass. From a glass to a pitcher. His body vibrated. A fine tremor ran from the top of his head to his toes. A fever rolled over him like a wave. Hot. Heavy. He clenched his teeth. He stayed on his feet. He stayed conscious. The pain was nothing. He knew worse pain. 9,200 years in the void. That was pain. And this was just the body, just channels, just physics. Sarah began to read. Her voice was thin, clear, ringing. The words of the first age filled the valley. For the first time in 10,000 years, this language was heard here. Ancient words, heavy. Each one weighed like a stone. Each syllable fell into the white silence and pierced a hole in it. A small one, a colorful one. Because the words of the first age were colorful. They carried mana within them. They were mana, frozen in sound. Every word was a key. Every syllable activated a rune on the pillar. The dead runes began to flicker. 1, 5, 6, 7. They awoke one after another, slowly, like embers fanned by the wind. Dull, pale, but alive. Isla struck the ground with her palms, both of them, hard. The earth responded, not with words, with a tremor, deep, powerful, coming from somewhere below, from beneath the white surface, from beneath the dead layer. Down there, the earth was still alive, old, tired, but alive. The stones around the seal rose, a centimeter, 2, 5. The earth remembered. The earth helped. Isla cried, quietly, not from pain, from gratitude. The earth responded, even here, even in the silence. Haley raised her hands. A fire flared up. Not orange, blue. The cold flame of the Union. Fire and shadow at the same time. Two schools in a single flame. The balance she had feared her whole life became her weapon. 3 seconds. 5. 10. She held on, clenching her teeth, clenching her fists, with tears on her cheeks. Hot from the fire and salty from fear, but she held on. 20 seconds. 30. The shadow stirred within her, reaching outward, wanting to escape. The fire pressed it back. Haley was a battlefield between two elements that had lived within her since birth, and she was winning. Not just one of them, both. She was winning by holding them together, in balance, in union. Maeve sank to her knees. She placed her hands on the white grass, her palms on the white earth, and a green glow spread around her. Life, pure, bright, brighter than ever. Because here, in the deadest place in the world, life burned brightest of all, like a candle in the dark, small, fragile, impossible, but burning. The silence retreated a step. 2. Color returned to the grass beneath her palms, green, alive. A small island of color in a white world. 3 stalks. 5. 10. Green, alive, real. Maeve was breathing, evenly, deeply, and every exhale carried life, and every exhale created wind, microscopic, invisible. But the pillar began to sound, quietly, low, wind. Hae-yun stood by the crack, sword drawn, eyes narrowed. Something crawled out of the crack, dark, shapeless, faceless, bodiless, formless, empty, a creature of nothingness, a mass of absence. It did not attack, it simply was. It simply squeezed through the crack, like water through a crack in a wall, without intent, without malice, without purpose, simply because the crack was open. The first void squeezed halfway through. Hae-yun sliced it in two with a single stroke, vertical, from top to bottom. The blade passed through the body of darkness, a runic cut, a silvery trail in the black, and the darkness crumbled, silently, without a scream. It simply ceased to be. The second, a horizontal strike, sliced open. The third, diagonal. The fourth, the fifth. They kept coming, one after another, a new one every few seconds. Hae-yun cut them down in silence, precise, no unnecessary movements. Every strike a rune, every stance a formula, every step a link in the chain she had been forging her whole life. The steel path, not magic, not power, discipline, repetition, perfection. Lyra ran between them, Haley's vial, green, thick. A sip, the fire brighter. 10 more minutes. Maeve's vial, blue, liquid. A sip, the green glow wider. 5 more minutes. Eileen's vial, green. A sip. The earth trembled harder, the stones rose higher. Lyra ran, from one to the other, with a vial in each hand. She kept them afloat, with potions she'd been brewing for a month, with words she whispered as she ran, with the touch of hands that knew where it hurt. She touched Haley's shoulder and Haley exhaled. She touched Maeve's forehead and Maeve opened her eyes. She squeezed Isla's hand and Isla smiled. 10 years of pain had taught her one thing, to know when a person was on the, and to give them just enough to hold on for another minute. Aiden stood in the center and wove. Runes flowed from his fingers, one after another, dozens, hundreds. He drew in the air. With both hands, his fingers moved so fast they seemed blurred. Every rune precise, every one in its place. 10,000 years of practice. Even with a thimbleful of mana, even with expanded channels that crackled under the strain. His hands remembered, his fingers remembered. He wove Haley's fire with the formula of light. He took strands of blue flame and passed them through the rune of purification. The fire lost its heat, lost its destruction. Pure energy remained. Light. The pillar glowed white, blinding, pure. He wove the shadow with the formula of time, darkness and duration, moment, and eternity. The shadow that remembers what was and knows what will be. The pillar began to hum, a low, drawn-out sound, the sound of eternity. He wove Isla's earth with the underground currents. He pulled threads from the stones downward, into the depths, where water flowed through cracks in the rock, dark, cold, alive. The pillar was covered in frost, drops on the stone, water. He wove Maeve's life with her breath, with the wind born of green stalks, with the world's exhalation. The pillar began to vibrate, slightly, quickly. Wind. One school after another, one thread after another, a web, a symphony, 9 voices in a single choir, 4 real ones and 5 woven from the real ones. A union, the art of the impossible. His body was burning. The channels were crackling. He felt the tiny channels in his fingers bursting, one after another, small flashes of pain, like needle pricks. The potion gave him strength, but the strength was crude, borrowed, not his own, like clothes from someone else's shoulders. Every minute cost him an hour of life, maybe more. He felt his body breaking down, slowly, inexorably. The channels were tearing, cells were dying. Something inside was being erased, irreversibly. It didn't matter. Not now, not here. 12 pillars were burning. All 12. All the runes. All 23 on each. 276 runes. All alive. All active. Light filled the valley. The white world turned golden. For the first time in thousands of years, there was color here. Real. Deep. Alive. The silence retreated. It pressed into the ground. It crawled back into the crack. The crack narrowed. Slowly, but inexorably. The empties screamed, soundlessly. Mouths open, bodies writhing. They crumbled one by one beneath Jian's blade. She struck, and cut. Her face wet with sweat, her hands wet with sweat. But the sword was dry, clean, precise. The final element, the seal, the anchor. Aiden stopped. The runes on his fingers faded. His body trembled. His hands shook. His legs buckled. He stood in the center of a burning circle of 12 pillars. Golden light surrounded him. Runes above him. The crack beneath him. Emptiness before him. Black. Waiting. Hungry. Someone must enter it. Touch it. Become a part of it. And remain. Forever. So the seal holds. So the crack does not open again. Eternal guardian. Eternal lock. Eternal solitude. Aiden stepped toward the void, and Sarah screamed. For the first time ever. For all 4 months. For all the years in the library. For her whole life. She screamed his name, his real one. Alistair. Her voice pierced the silence like a spear, high-pitched, thin, desperate. She understood. Of course she understood. She read the runes, knew the language, saw the seal's formula from the first pillar to the last. She saw the closure, and she knew what the anchor meant, knew what forever meant. She screamed not out of fear, out of understanding. He turned toward her, looked, gray eyes behind the lenses of his glasses, full of tears. His glasses were fogged up. She took them off, wiped them, put them back on. Tears were flowing again. She shook her head. No, no, there must be another way. Aiden smiled, warmly, wearily. The face of a boy, an old man's smile. He said there was no other way, that he had known from the very beginning, from the day he read the message on the anchor stone, that this was exactly why he had returned. Not for the academy, not for the students, not for himself, for the seal, for the world, so that white might become colorful again. The seal cannot hold without an anchor. Only the Creator can be the anchor. Ayla ran up to him, little feet on the white stone. She grabbed his hand, with both hands. Little fingers clung to his palm, with a strength a 13-year-old girl shouldn't have. She wasn't crying. She looked at him, and her face was so grown up, so old, so heavy for 13 years. She said she wouldn't let him go, that he had promised, that he had told Nora he would bring her back, that if he stayed here, who would bring her home? Who would teach her to ask the earth? Who would make her a new amulet when this one wore out? Who? Haley stood with her arms hanging down. The fire went out. A shadow swirled around her fingers, dark and thick. She was silent, but tears streamed down her cheeks, not hot from the fire, cold, ordinary, human. Hae-yun drove her sword into the ground, hilt deep. The stone cracked. She stood before him, between him and the void, her face stony, her eyes dry. She wasn't crying. She didn't know how, but her body spoke for her. I won't let you pass, not through me. Maeve sank to her knees. The green glow in her hands flickered, faint, the last of it. She had given everything. Lyra stood motionless, arms at her sides, empty. All the vials were spent. Her face was pale. Her lips were pressed together. Aiden stood and watched them, the 6 people, who had become his world in 4 months. In 4 short months of a life 10,000 millennia long. At the librarian girl who believed in fairy tales, and turned out to be right, because all fairy tales began with the truth. At the alchemist woman who had lived in pain for 10 years, and who was standing on her own 2 feet again, because he had shown her how. At the younger sister who hears the earth, and speaks with stones, and weeps with gratitude when the stones answer. To the heiress who chose truth over a coat of arms, and a blue flame over an orange one. To the warrior who sleeps at his door, and drives his sword into stone, so as not to let him slip into the void. To the herbalist who speaks to wounds, and coaxes them to close, and who has just brought color back to the dead valley. His people, his family, his second class. The first one died 10,000 years ago. Lyra stepped forward. Her face was calm, quiet, without panic, without despair. The face of a person who had made a decision. A long time ago, maybe a week ago, maybe a month. Maybe at the moment when she was brewing the 23rd vial and crying at night in the workshop. Her voice was steady. She said that anyone who knows the sealing formula can be the anchor. Not just the seal's creator, anyone. She had read the formula, on the stones surrounding the seal, in the language of the first age. She had studied that language for 4 months, and learned enough. She looked him in the eyes and said, quietly, without trembling, without heroism, simply like a fact. She had lived 10 years in darkness, in pain, in solitude, without channels, without magic, without a touch of the world. 10 years in emptiness. She knows what emptiness is. She isn't afraid. She had already been there, and she returned, because he had restored the light to her, restored the channels, restored the fire to her palm, restored the ability to touch the world. And she wants that light to go to someone else. Not her, them, the world, future students, future classes. He has people who need him alive. He has Isla. He has Sarah. He has 5 who will be lost without him. He has a world that needs to be taught anew. He has 1,000 years of knowledge that needs to be passed on. And she has only gratitude, which she wants to repay, the only way that matters. Aiden shook his head, slowly. It's hard, he said no, that he wouldn't let her, that she didn't come back for this, that he didn't open her channels for this, not so she could walk into the void. Lyra smiled, that smile he'd seen for the first time. In all 4 months, in all their conversations, in all their evenings in the workshop. Warm, uninhibited, without sarcasm, without a shield. No mask, no wall, just a smile, just Lyra. For the first time in 10 years. She said she wasn't asking for permission. Maeve stood up, slowly, on trembling legs. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand. She walked over to Lyra. She placed her hands on Lyra's shoulders. A green glow enveloped them both. Soft, final, all that remained. Maeve spoke softly, Her voice trembled, but her words did not. The school of life could give the anchor what Alistair had lacked 10,000 years ago. A connection, a thread. Thin, fragile, but alive. A thread through which the anchor would feel the world. Not see, not hear, not touch. Just know that it exists. That behind the seal there is morning and evening and rain and snow and the smell of grass after the rain. And Isla's laughter and the scratch of Sarah's quill and the clang of Hae-yun's sword and the crackling of Haley's fire and Aiden's voice as he lectures. That this is not emptiness. It is a dream, a long one, quiet, from which one can wake up, someday, when the world becomes strong enough to hold the seal on its own, without an anchor. Silence, long. The golden light of the seal, the flickering of the runes, the wind from the pillars, the sound that has returned to the valley. Lyra turned toward the void, the black space between the pillars, waiting, hungry, but not evil. The void isn't evil. It's just empty. It needs to be filled with something. Lyra took a step. Aiden grabbed her by the hand, for the last time. She stopped, looked over her shoulder. Her face was calm. His eyes were dry. A smile, that one, warm. He said one thing. His voice broke halfway through, but he finished. He said she wasn't alone, that Maeve's thread would hold, that he himself would come to every pillar every year and renew the runes, every one of the 276, with his own hands, that she wouldn't be in the void, she would be in a dream, and that he would wake her when he found a way, and he would find one, because he always had. 10,000 years. Every time the world said it was impossible, he found a way, and he would find one, he promised. Lyra squeezed his hand, tightly, for a second, then she let go. Then she stepped into the void between the pillars. Darkness embraced her, gently, quietly, like a blanket, like an embrace, like a sleep after a long day. She didn't scream, didn't flinch, she just walked in and vanished. Maeve screamed, briefly, sharply, and she thrust both hands forward, all her remaining mana, all her life, everything she had. A green thread stretched from her fingers into the darkness, thin, thinner than a hair, glowing, alive, pulsing. The thread tightened, trembled, and remained. It didn't snap, it didn't vanish, it remained. Between Maeve and the darkness, between the world and the void, between life and sleep. The seal flared, all 12 pillars lit up, with a blinding white light, not golden, white, pure. That white which is not the absence of color, but all colors at once. The crack closed, instantly, like a wound stitched up from the inside. The black resin vanished, the voids vanished, everything, all at once. They scattered, the silence receded, sound returned, the wind, real, alive. The grass rustled, the stones hummed, the world sighed, deeply, heavily, like a person who has awakened after a long faint, like a world that has woken up. Color returned to the valley, slowly. First green, grass, stalks, leaves. Then blue, the sky, clouds, a clearing. Then yellow, the sun, real, warm. The first sun in this valley in thousands of years. Then all the rest. Brown stone, gray rock, red clay. The world was coming back to life, piece by piece, color by color, sound by sound. Aiden stood by the pillar and looked at the spot where Lyra had been. The void was gone. Between the pillars was a stone, smooth, warm, new. A stone that hadn't been there before. A stone that had grown out of the void. And if you pressed your palm, if you pressed your fingers against the smooth surface, you could feel a pulse, slow, steady, calm, alive. 60 beats per minute, like a human heart, like the heart of a sleeping woman. He placed his hand on it. He closed his eyes. Tears streamed down his cheeks. 2, 3, 4. He didn't wipe them away, and he whispered, in the language of the first age, quietly, just for her. I'll find a way, I promise. The stone pulsed beneath his palm, slowly, steadily, like an answer. They were returning south, 6 of them, not 7. One place in the ranks was empty. Maeve walked with her hand held out in front of her. A green thread stretched from her fingers toward the north, invisible to everyone but her. Thin, fragile, alive. A connection that would not be broken. She walked and felt the pulse, through the thread, across miles, through stone and air and earth. 60 beats per minute. Lyra is sleeping. Lyra is alive. Lyra is waiting. Ayla walked beside Aiden. She held his hand. She was silent, her small palm in his, warm, wet with tears she had wiped away and that were flowing again. Haley walked behind them. The fire in her palms was steady, blue, not orange. She was no longer afraid of the shadow. The shadow was a part of her, like fire, like hands, like a heart. Ji-yoon walked ahead, sword in its sheath, eyes on the road, back straight. She didn't look back. No need. She knew he was following her. She always knew. Sarah walked beside Maeve, notebook open, pen in hand. She was writing. Everything. Every step, every stone, every color returning, every sound awakening, for future generations, for those who would come after, for those who would read and understand. The road south was long, but colorful. The world was coming back to life, faster than they expected. The trees in the dead forest began to turn green, slowly, one leaf at a time, but they began. Buds on the black branches, tiny, green, alive. The birds had returned. One sang on a branch as they passed by, small, gray, with a yellow breast. It sang, and its voice was the most beautiful sound they had ever heard. Ayla lifted her head, looked at the bird, and smiled. For the first time in 2 days, the smile of a 13-year-old girl, tired, salty from tears, but genuine. They returned to Silver a week later, 7 days' journey south. Every day the world was livelier, greener, louder, more colorful. Streams flowed. The wind rustled through the leaves. The sun was warm. The world was waking up. The academy greeted them with silence, not magical, human. The silence of people standing in the courtyard and watching, and not knowing what to say. Because 7 had gone north, and 6 had returned. All but 1. Lyra Ventries. The alchemy instructor, the woman who had been years had been disabled, who, 4 months ago, had lit a fire in her palm again, who brewed potions at night and wept over the last vial, did not return. Maeve stood in the courtyard and held her hand, a green thread to the north, invisible. She would hold it forever, every day, every night, every year, until it breaks, or until Lyra wakes up. Aiden walked through the academy courtyard, past the fountain that was working again. The water gurgled, bright, clear. Mana was returning, and the fountain sensed it first. Past the training hall, where stone targets stood in a row. One of them still bore the inscription Kyle in fiery letters. Past the library where the light was on. It was always on. Sarah was already there, already writing, already cataloging, already planning. He reached his room, a small cubbyhole in the east wing, a bed, a desk, a chair, a window facing east, morning light, a pillow and blanket by the door. Ji-yoon. She's already there, lying down, eyes closed, not sleeping, waiting for him to come in and lie down. Then she'll fall asleep. He came in, sat on the bed, and for the first time in 10,000 years, he allowed himself to cry. Quietly, briefly. 3 minutes, no more. Because 10,000 years have taught him one thing. It's okay to cry, but not for long. Because after the tears, you have to get up and work. Always. After every loss, after every goodbye, after every person who leaves. Get up, work, remember. to find a way to bring them back. 3 minutes. Then he wiped his eyes, with his sleeve, like a boy, because he was a boy, 15 years old, with 10,000 years inside him. He stood up, walked over to the table, opened a notebook, blank, new, white pages, like a valley. Only these white pages would he fill, with color, with words, with knowledge. And he began to write, in the language of the first age, letter by letter, rune by rune, a textbook, a real one, complete. From the first rune to the last, all 9 schools, all the formulas, all the structures, everything he knew, everything he remembered, everything he had lived through. 10,000 years of knowledge on white pages. He wrote his name on the spine. Sarah Ashwood, the first copy. There will be others. For Haley, for Ayla, for Maeve, for Ji-yoon, for everyone who comes after, for everyone who wants to learn, for everyone who believes that the conjunction is not heresy but a bridge between schools, between people, between the past and the future. Outside the window, the evening sun illuminated the towers of Silverhaven, the academy he founded 10,000 years ago, when his name was Alistair Vane, when the world was young, when manna was as plentiful as water in the ocean, when the 9 schools sang in unison, the academy that was dying, that was losing its knowledge bit by bit every century, that had forgotten its own language, and that would now live on. Because 6 people had passed through the silence and returned, with fire, with earth, with life, with a sword, with a book, with a thread. And because 1 woman remained in the darkness, so that the world might remain in the light. Aiden wrote until dark. Then he lit a candle, a small one, an ordinary one, not a magical one, a wax one, with a cotton wick. It burned with an even yellow light, warm, alive. He continued. The runes fell onto the paper evenly and precisely. Every letter was a promise. I will find a way. Every page was a brick of a new world, which he would build, not alone, with his people, with the 2nd edition of Silverhaven, with the 6 people who had passed through the white and returned with color. Behind the wall, someone knocked, quietly, timidly. He opened the door. Ayla, in her nightgown, hair loose, an amulet around her neck, warm, glowing, eyes red from crying, red, swollen. She hadn't slept, not for a minute, since they'd returned. She didn't say a word. She just stepped toward him and hugged him, tiny arms around his waist, her face pressed against his shirt. And Aiden hugged her back, tightly, like an older brother, like a great-great-great-great-grandfather, like a man who is 10,000 years old and has finally understood why it was worth coming back. Not for the seal, not for the world, not for silence, for this, for the little arms around his waist, for the wet face pressed against his shirt, for the man who holds you tight and won't let go, because he's afraid of losing you, because he's already lost one, and he doesn't want to lose another. He stood in the doorway of a small room in the east wing of Silverhaven Academy. A candle burned on the table. A notebook lay open. A quill sat in an inkwell. Evening outside the window. The first evening of the new world. A world in which silence had retreated. A world in which color has returned. A world in which 1 woman sleeps in stone so that the rest may wake. Morning will come, a new one. The first, the real one. And he will write the next page. And the next, and the next, until he finds a way. And he will find it, because he always has.